Lucy Davies was born in 1971 in the county of Rhondda, England. She was the daughter of Roger and Andrea Davies, who were also the proud parents of another girl named Anna. The family was settled in a small community mainly formed by socially purposed housing. There, against the backdrop of beautiful mountain scenery, Lucy had a particularly happy childhood. Since she and her little sister had similar tastes, they were always very close. Her parents always highlighted Lucy's infectious joy as a standout quality. During her time in primary school, Lucy was known for her outgoing and likable temperament, which immediately endeared her to teachers and classmates alike. In addition to her charming personality, she was also recognized for her undeniable beauty, making her one of the most popular and admired girls at school. Regarding interests outside of academics, both she and Anna loved ponies. Knowing this, their father pleasantly surprised them by enrolling both in the local riding club. This sporting activity taught them discipline and also showcased their talent. Consequently, they earned the right to participate and represent the club in countless events and competitions. Thus, by the start of secondary school, Lucy shone as an exceptional rider. However, her energy and passion were not limited to the tracks, as the versatile young lady began to take flute and piano lessons, dedicating long hours to practice to master both instruments. Her efforts soon paid off, and by the following year, Lucy had a very comprehensive and detailed mastery of the wide field of classical music. Thanks to this, she was accepted into a youth orchestra and also joined her school's choir group. As often happens in this stage of adolescence, a healthy romantic interest appeared in her life, and Lucy became very close to Gareth Jenkins. However, she preferred to keep it a secret. In 1989, after finishing secondary school, Lucy was determined to pursue a career in the musical world. With that goal in mind, she enrolled to undertake a bachelor's degree at the University of Warwick. There, she began her new and promising life, always with the aspiration of becoming a teacher and dedicating herself to musical education. But things did not go as she had expected. While her passion remained, she did not enjoy the direction of the degree program. Consequently, she decided to switch her original plan and opted to study urban planning. It was around this time that she met Graham McAllister. They both discovered quite soon that their outlook on life was very similar. Aside from their love for art and shared interests, a crucial detail in their bond was the extravagant sense of humor that complemented each other. Their relationship flowed naturally, and as they made plans for the future, Lucy decided to introduce him to her parents. For Roger and Andrea, the meeting was wonderful, as they were certain that Graham was the right one for their daughter. So much so that they decided to buy Lucy a house in the city of Coventry, northwest of London. This gesture, in addition to ensuring her a life free from the upheavals of rent and moving, carried their wish for her to start a family. Shortly after moving in, Lucy invited her boyfriend to share the new home. As they continued with their studies in 1995, the young couple welcomed their first child, whom they named James. Lucy decided it was best to take a break from university to care for him. Meanwhile, Graham continued with his university commitments and, to support the household expenses, got a job working the night shift at the city's postal sorting office. Over the months, this dynamic began to affect Lucy, because alone at home, dedicated exclusively to the child, and with many hours away from her partner, a feeling of boredom took hold of her. Then, she found no better solution than to explore internet chat rooms for distraction. In this universe, she sought to meet new people. One night, while Lucy was immersed in lively conversations in various chat rooms, she came into contact with Harold Landry. At 53 years old and of American origin, Harold came from a financially struggling family in Louisiana. However, He understood early on that, being just one among a dozen siblings, he would have to achieve everything through his own effort and will. Thus, from a young age, he dedicated himself to hard work to escape poverty. His opportunity arrived when he realized that in the oil business, the key was not in owning a well, but in providing the essential infrastructure for the owners of such fields. Consequently, he founded his own company, focused exclusively on the design and manufacture of hydraulic equipment for major oil companies in the southern United States. As he had anticipated, the business allowed him to amass a great fortune, eventually reaching billionaire status. By that time, he divided his time between his eccentric hobbies and a property on the island of Cozumel in Mexico. On a personal level, he had been married and divorced twice. From these unions, he had children whose exact number and identities are not publicly known. What was known, however, was that Harold made sure they lacked nothing. A particularly relevant event occurred in 1992 when, being single again, he met a married woman 20 years his junior. However, neither her family nor her husband were obstacles for Harold, who directed all his seductive strategy towards her and won her over. On February 6, 1994, Harold picked her up to take her for a ride in New Orleans. For this occasion, they hired a babysitter. After concluding the evening, Harold accompanied his lover back to her home and offered to take the babysitter back to hers. No one seemed concerned about the fact that the husband would find out about the betrayal and could act as a wounded man. In fact, that's exactly what happened. Outside the residence, the betrayed husband was monitoring every move of his wife. Once the third party said goodbye, he followed him in his car. A few minutes later, Harold finally noticed the vehicle tailing him. Then, almost as an instinctive gesture, he opened the glove compartment and pulled out the firearm he usually kept. When both stopped at a red light, things spiraled out of control, as the babysitter later narrated. Harold then brandished a revolver at the betrayed husband and fired. The bullet severed an artery in his neck and damaged a nerve leading to a vocal cord. The husband, called Chris Price, collapsed on the pavement with a wound on his neck, but fortunately, there was a hospital right in front of them, which allowed him to receive immediate aid, and the doctors were able to save his life. As for Harold, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The trial against him took place in 1997. In his opening statement, the defense attorney told the jury that Chris had only been the victim of a tragic and sordid affair. Regarding his client, he mentioned that he acted out of fear and in self-defense. The defense's clever strategy led the jury, consisting of 4 men and 8 women, to find Harold guilty of the lesser charge of aggravated assault. As a result, he was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. After appealing, Harold obtained probation. In exchange, he had to pay a fine of $500 and fulfill community service obligations. Although he sought to be completely exonerated, he thanked Pat for his hard work. Since then, they became great friends. Shortly after, Harold and Chris agreed on an undisclosed settlement amount. By the time Harold began talking with Lucy, he was residing in Covington and was still wealthy enough not to have to work. He was also honest about his occupations and everything related to his past life, including love affairs and legal details. But all these elements only served to increase Lucy's attraction to him. What followed was an engaging online romance, with Harold promising her a more than tempting lifestyle. His persistence and persuasive power bore fruit when Lucy finally asked Graham to end their relationship. Thus, he had the path clear, without a rival that could cause him trouble, as had happened with Chris. With the wind in his favor in the early 2000s, Harold traveled to England to meet her, and she took the opportunity to introduce him to her parents as her boyfriend. Although Roger and Andrea were surprised by the significant age difference, they respected their daughter's decisions and did not object to the relationship. Feeling fulfilled and fortunate to share his life with her, Harold spared no effort to surprise her, whether with luxurious gifts or anything else Lucy desired. In fact, by then, he was so in love that he was already planning to propose marriage. However, he didn't want it to be just any proposal. He wished to do it in an ideal setting. To achieve this goal, he took her, along with her son James, and included Graham in the group on a trip. The chosen destination was Mexico, which for Harold was by then his favorite place in the world. Additionally, his longtime friend Pat, who had been his attorney in the past trial, also had an apartment close to his residence, which added to the feeling of comfort. Initially, Harold bought a diamond ring and shared the news with enthusiasm with Pat. Nonetheless, his friend harbored certain suspicions about his future fiancée. Moreover, over the days, Pat found it strange that Lucy had dedicated a good part of her time in the company of Graham. He seemed to be completely blind to it, and ultimately, he proceeded with his plan to propose. Lucy happily accepted the proposal, and in mid-2003, the couple celebrated their union. Shortly afterward, Harold surprised her by acquiring a $1 million property in an exclusive neighborhood in Worcestershire. In this rural setting, the marriage had a prosperous and peaceful start, further favored by the presence of excellent neighbors like Rachel Clark and Stephen Kennedy, with whom Harold and Lucy formed a lovely friendship. Soon, the newlyweds had their first daughter, whom they named Harriet. The event filled both Lucy and Harold with joy, and from then on, he dedicated himself to the little girl with undiminished energy and commitment. Equally important and affectionate was the relationship he maintained with James, whom he treated as if he were his own son. But relentless time began to erode their initial bliss. Gradually, the demands made towards Lucy increased, and her moodiness became directly proportional to her husband's demands. As he saw it, his wife was to constantly adjust to his preferences and adopt a submissive role to his requests. She, on the other hand, had different expectations, so tensions quickly became apparent. As a conclusion, Lucy was direct and unafraid to express her thoughts, and in this dynamic, her husband was not willing to yield. With both having volatile personalities, their arguments often culminated in explosive breakups, followed by reconciliation once the storm had passed. Thus, moments that had once been pleasurable, like the children's vacations, became increasingly marred by fights. Meanwhile, James witnessed the disintegration of his mother and stepfather's relationship. To their neighbors' dismay, the disputes that stretched on for hours became a sort of regular soundtrack. By that time, Rachel and Stephen were aware that the couple had a tendency to abuse alcohol, knowing well that this was the fuel that ignited their shouting and complaints. When Lucy and Harold unleashed all their anger, leading to prolonged periods of not speaking to each other, their neighbors felt peace return. In mid-2009, thanks to social media, Lucy reconnected with Gareth. Having had no contact since their platonic love in secondary school, they caught up and chatted for hours, with necessary interruptions due to both of their commitments. After Harold went to sleep, his wife stayed in front of the screen. Soon, it became evident to him that, feeling unhappy, his wife had resorted to the same escape route through which she had found him, and he had no doubt she was looking for a replacement. However, far from confronting her, he considered giving her some space and traveled to Mexico, where he stayed for a while. Meanwhile, Lucy took the opportunity to invite Gareth to stay with her. In the autumn of 2009, her husband returned to England, thinking this time would resolve their marriage. But as soon as he stepped into the house, Lucy asked him for a divorce. Initially, he felt devastated. Then, after a few weeks, Harold began a relationship. He met this new woman online, She lived in the vicinity and went by the name of Rachel. Parallel to each of their new romances, the divorce negotiations were underway, and as often happens, new conflicts emerged. Especially concerning the house, Lucy expected to keep it to ensure a roof over her children's heads. For Harold, on the other hand, this matter was non-negotiable. His solution was to offer her money to buy herself a more modest apartment on her own. At the same time, he completely excluded her from his will. Upon learning of the decisions of her still husband, Lucy flew into a rage. Her feelings of hatred towards him made her share everything about Harold's past with her son James, not leaving anything out. Amidst the complicated process and considering the evident tension she was living in, Gareth invited her to spend a few days with him in Wales. Upon her return to familiar surroundings, Lucy no longer wished to disguise or hide her lengthy phone conversations with her new love. Meanwhile, both she and Harold were immersed in excessive alcohol consumption. The arguments escalated to unexpected heights, leaving the children at the mercy of a violent and unbearable atmosphere. On the afternoon of Monday, February 1st, 2010, Harold drank several glasses of wine. At one point, he received a package intended for Stephen. Around 9 o'clock at night, when Stephen returned from work, he found a postal notification indicating that his parcel had been delivered to his neighbor. The Landry's lights were on, so he went there. Harold invited him in and served him a glass of wine. After greeting Lucy and exchanging a few words, Stephen noticed how drunk his host was. He took his package, excused himself, and left. Subsequently, the couple engaged in a nonsensical argument, specifically over a furniture purchase she was planning for their move. James acted as the years of fights had taught him. This time, the disagreement escalated to a physical altercation. In the scuffle, Harold grabbed a kitchen utensil with which he struck Lucy on the cheek. Unable to continue avoiding the facts, James appeared at the scene of the dispute and found his mother injured. He immediately called the police and then focused on securing his younger sister's safety. Not long after, Lucy and her children left the house seeking help. The first place she thought to go was to Stephen's house. However, just as she headed in that direction, Harold caught up to her and, with a knife, caused her multiple injuries. Then he left her under a bush in the garden and walked away. Alerted by the screams, Stephen went outside. It only took him a few steps to discover his neighbor. Although he initially thought she was unconscious, he quickly understood the severity of the situation. At that moment, responding to the emergency call, the police arrived at the scene. They called the paramedics and searched the vicinity for the perpetrator. However, they only found the children, hidden and terrified in the backyard amidst the darkness. Once on site, the paramedics acted as quickly as possible, and Lucy was transported to the hospital. Very shortly after, her heart stopped. Meanwhile, Harold went to Rachel's house and confessed that something terrible had happened, but without giving further details. He then gave her 3 bank drafts totaling $40,000, a sum of cash, the keys to his car, and several signed blank checks. Then he set off back home. By that time, several police patrols were trying to locate him. Eventually, they found him walking along the road and proceeded to arrest him. Roger and Andrea were overwhelmed with despair upon hearing the tragic news. In a statement shared by the police, they asked for respect during their time of unimaginable sorrow from losing their daughter. For now, they had nothing more to say to the media. From then on, all their attention was focused on looking after their grandchildren. The forensic examination confirmed that Lucy had died as a result of multiple stab wounds to the chest. With this evidence and having James as a first-hand witness on February 5, 2010, Harold appeared before the court and was charged with murder. The trial took place in early February 2011. It was presided over by Judge David Foskett. On this occasion, Pat was not the defender of his friend. That task fell to attorney Andy Childs. Despite the evident difficulty of his task, the defense attorney argued that his client had been provoked by the fury of his wife, who left him no alternative but to act as he did. During his initial statements from the stand, Harold, amidst sobs, stated that he loved Lucy and regretted his actions. He then adhered to the strategy laid out by his lawyer, admitting to involuntary manslaughter because, in his words, Lucy had pushed him to the limit. To highlight the violence of the case, the prosecution presented a very detailed animation of the multiple injuries suffered by the victim. This presentation was shocking to those present in the courtroom. Finally, on February 24, 2011, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Harold Landry guilty of the murder of his wife, Lucy Landry, who was 38 years old at the time of her death, while Harold was 64. The following day was for the judge to impose the sentence. He had harsh words for Harold, whose attack he described as indescribable and unforgivable. He also dismissed Harold's claims of possible provocation by Lucy, considering them a vain attempt by the defendant to save himself. Consequently, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years before being eligible for parole. By that time, however, he would be over 80 years old. Lucy's loved ones thanked not only for the resolution, but also for the judge's remarks, which they felt almost perfectly expressed what they themselves felt. They noted that the sentence somehow helped alleviate the pain of their loss, although they also admitted that no number of years in prison for Harold would bring back Lucy's life, so they would have to work on accepting this painful reality. For his part, Harold insisted on proclaiming his innocence, as he was heard saying he hoped to be able to appeal the sentence in the future. Melissa Chavez was born in 2008 in the city of Coquimbo, Chile. She was the youngest child of Mirta Ardil and Denny Chavez, who already had 3 children. Although Mirta and Denny were really nice people, the couple decided to separate shortly after Melissa's birth after 8 years together. However, Melissa's paternal family continued to stay in touch with her. Her aunt, Gina Chavez, had a special affection for her and was always concerned for her well-being. To support her household as a single mother, Mirta worked various jobs, including in a bar. It was there she became very close friends with Maria Teresa Caballero, a co-worker. Almost every night after closing the bar, Maria would head to another nearby bar to work extra hours and earn more money. Since Mirta often accompanied her wherever she went, she eventually found employment at that place as well. One night, while Mirta was working at the bar, a regular customer approached her. His name was Luis. Although details about his life are scarce, it is known he was born in 1981, worked in a mine in Antofagasta, and lived with his then partner. This first encounter led to a romance that neither Luis's ongoing relationship nor their age difference, with Mirta being 8 years his senior, could prevent. Eventually, Luis left his partner and moved in with Mirta by the year 2010, when Melissa was just 2 years old. By this time, Melissa's reserved nature was already evident, a trait that did not change much as she grew older. When she started school, she was kind but clearly found it hard to socialize and had few friends. Her shyness extended towards Luis, whom she saw as a stranger. However, in 2012, when her mother and he welcomed their first child together, the new sibling helped Melissa to start accepting Luis into her life. From that point forward, he also took on a role in her upbringing, offering her affection and care as if she were his own daughter. In turn, she began to refer to him as her father. This dynamic continued for a while, allowing Melissa to experience something she had almost never had, a sense of a home without fractures. But in 2014, Luis's behavior towards her changed. Everything occurred one afternoon when he was looking after her while Mirta was at work. Just then, without warning, what had always been merely affectionate treatment turned into inappropriate touching. Melissa first confided in one of her older sisters and only afterward alerted her mother. Around the same time, the girl was seen by her school's psychologist, to whom she also revealed what had happened. Faced with the alarming disclosure and the need to act to protect the girl, the news was communicated to the school's principal. She reached out to Mirta, and knowing how serious the situation was, the psychologist and they went to talk to the authorities. A complaint was filed through the psychologist and the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor's office immediately opened a case, and as a result, the courts decided to revoke the mother's custody of her daughter. Initially, it was thought that temporary custody would be given to the biological father. However, at that time, his situation was far from ideal. On the contrary, he was suffering from deep depression and struggling with alcoholism. As such, Melissa was placed in the care of her Aunt Gina. As for Mirta, in October 2014, the same court referred her to a family court program. The goal was to subject her to psychological and psychiatric assessments. Last but not least, to regain custody of her daughter, she was required to separate from Luis. During the process, she assured the authorities that she had indeed left him. However, the reality was that she was still in contact with him secretly. After 17 months, in March 2016, following supposed new evaluations that concluded Mirta was capable of resuming personal care of her daughter, the Child Protection Agency of Coquimbo returned the custody to her. Once Melissa was back home with her, the woman also took Luis back. Not content with having the girl and the aggressor live under the same roof, Mirta went to the authorities to retract the complaints against him. Since then, the agencies closed the investigation and did not follow up on the case. Several years passed with no records of any irregular events. It's unknown whether they didn't occur or were hidden. Thus, when September 2020 arrived, Mirta and Luis moved with Melissa and her younger brother to a 2-story house. The idea was to rebuild their lives in a calmer environment. Melissa, who was 12 years old at the time, had started secondary school and was in the 7th grade. As her mother had noticed, she was becoming a more independent young lady, which was evident, for example, in her long stays alone in her room, almost always listening to music. Sleeping in was another thing she enjoyed. And while she occasionally complained that her mother was too strict and demanding, overall, Melissa seemed content in the new neighborhood. But just then, Luis sought to resume the inappropriate behavior towards her, which had been suspended after the whole ordeal caused by the initial complaint. This time, fully aware of what was happening, Mirta chose to pretend nothing was happening. She didn't even make a complaint to protect her daughter. Instead, she often felt really jealous because Luis paid more attention to Melissa. The morning of November 26, 2020 proceeded with complete normality as everyone prepared to leave the house. But before that, Luis entered the teenager's room and, unlike previous instances, completed the act in its entirety. After the abuse, he left Melissa lying on her bed, devoid of any desire to move, deeply sad and ashamed. Around 10:30 that morning, Luis and his son left the house and took a taxi they had ordered in advance through an app. The sequence was recorded by the area's security cameras. While they were going to a vaccination day at the Sun School in the city center, Mirta was losing the battle against her inner demons. Alone with her daughter at home, the woman took a knife from the kitchen and went upstairs to Melissa's bedroom. At that time, the girl had succumbed to sleep amidst tears and despair. Once in front of her, her mother attacked her, causing multiple injuries that left her agonizing. Then, Myrta sent text messages to her dentist to arrange an appointment. Afterward, she returned to Melissa's room and set fire to the lower part of the bed, where the young girl had already lost all signs of life. It was just after 11 a.m. when closed-circuit cameras recorded her leaving the home. After stopping at a store to withdraw money, Myrta took a taxi she had ordered and went to her dental appointment. Once again, her movements were captured by cameras. Barely 7 minutes after her departure, neighbors noticed smoke coming from the house and contacted emergency services. Meanwhile, Luis and his son, on their way back, saw the fire truck speeding past them. As they approached their home, Luis could see the firefighter struggling to control the flames engulfing his house. Shocked and incredulous, he called Myrta. She confirmed that she had left Melissa sleeping. Upon receiving this information, his distress was uncontrollable, so much so that he even tried to enter, but the authorities prevented him. Meanwhile, neighbors tried to offer support and calm him down. Once the team managed to partially control the fire, they identified that it had originated in one of the bedrooms. Upon entering, they found Melissa's lifeless body, which had not been completely consumed by the fire. Initially, rescuers suggested that smoke inhalation might have been the cause of her death. As for Myrta, she returned home, ready to pretend. Already notified of the tragedy, both she and Luis appeared devastated in front of the neighbors and the television cameras present. Unaware of the truth, Luis demanded justice, stating, "The person responsible, they're going to have to pay. They will have to pay for everything they did." Once Melissa's remains were transferred to the morgue, the investigation at the scene continued, and investigators collected some kitchen utensils and other items from the house for further analysis. Early findings led to the initial hypothesis of death by smoke inhalation being dismissed, and the possibility of third-party involvement began to gain traction. In the preliminary autopsy report, forensic experts noted that the body showed signs of blunt force trauma and puncture wounds. While the prosecutor requested to wait for the final results, the information somehow leaked, and soon, neighbors took to the streets demanding justice for Melissa and expressing their fear of a criminal loose in the area. After the forensic analyses were completed, and while waiting for the detailed and definitive report, Melissa's body was released to her family for the wake and subsequent burial. At the funeral, Myrta urged anyone with relevant information to cooperate in the search for the truth and clarification of the case. Visibly affected, Luis did the same. However, suspicions were directed at the victim's mother, especially considering she had been the last to leave the house on that fateful day. Others claimed to have seen an older man leaving just before the smoke was noticed. This last theory was convenient for Myrta, who clung to it. However, upon reviewing the security cameras around the house, investigators found no evidence of the alleged presence of this individual. Therefore, they decided to pause this line of inquiry while continuing to search for new clues. Meanwhile, since their involvement could not be entirely ruled out, Luis and Myrta were summoned as suspects. On that occasion, both repeated their version of events. Additionally, their cell phones were made available to the authorities. Shortly after, the autopsy results confirmed the severity of the attack Melissa suffered, which, according to forensic doctors, would not have been fatal had she received timely medical help. The detectives in charge of the case revealed chilling details, confirming she suffered cranioencephalic trauma and had 11 sharp force injuries. The worst part was that they estimated she had agonized for approximately an hour. Recent sexual abuse was also indicated by injuries, but no genetic material could be retrieved. From that moment, Luis became a focus for the prosecutor, who could not ignore the 2014 precedent. Meanwhile, Chemical tests performed on the seized utensils found traces of the victim's and her mother's DNA, particularly on the knife used in the attack. The prosecutor's office revealed crucial details about this evidence. The knife used in the attack had a distinctive tip damage, matching the injuries and fractures on the teenager's skull. Moreover, it wasn't just that the mother's and daughter's DNA was found, but where it was located. According to the Legal Medical Service, Melissa's genetic material was on the blade, and a significant genetic fingerprint of Myrta was on the handle. Chemical tests also showed that after being used as a weapon, it was washed to remove blood traces. With all this evidence supporting a case beyond reasonable doubt, on February 2, 2021, Myrta was arrested as the alleged perpetrator of the crime. Later, the police provided details including their knowledge of the events. At the formalization hearing, the public prosecutor charged Myrta with the crime of homicide. After presenting a video that evidenced the chronology of the event, the prosecutor pointed out the absence of eyewitnesses, the mother's attempt to erase all evidence, and the short span between her departure and the smoke sighting. In summary, for the public prosecutor, it was a passionate and ferocious crime. Although the defense insisted on her innocence, the prosecutor dismissed the idea outright. During the investigation, Myrta was held in preventive detention for 6 months. However, the public prosecutor's office still needed to investigate the nature of the relationship between Luis and the minor. Aware of his precarious situation, Luis fled. Despite authorities' efforts to locate him, neither relatives nor friends had any information about his whereabouts. In parallel, a multitude of neighbors and family members expressed their condemnation of Myrta, demanding justice for Melissa, while the house became a symbol of commemoration and protest. Myrta's defense attorney challenged the decision to keep her detained during the investigation period. But on February 10th, the Court of Appeals confirmed the preventive detention measure against Myrta. One of the most affected was obviously Gina Melissa's paternal aunt. Amid her grief, she criticized the failures of a system that, in her opinion, did not adequately follow up with the family or verify that the mother was qualified to regain custody. She was particularly outraged that the authorities had not ensured Myrta and Luis's separation. Eventually, the various efforts to locate Luis yielded results on Wednesday, November 17, 2021, when he was discovered in the upper area of Coquimbo. He was handed over to justice, facing charges for repeated abuses of a minor. The next day, the defendant was made available to the Court of Guarantees. During the hearing, the prosecution presented further details of the crimes he had committed against Melissa. After hearing the arguments of the prosecution, ordered preventive detention for Luis and his admission to jail, arguing that releasing him posed a danger to society. Meanwhile, on November 29th, the prosecution formally charged Myrta and added a new charge for being an accomplice to the sexual crimes committed by her partner against her daughter. Nearly a year later, on September 23, 2022, the investigation's closing hearing took place. That day, the arguments of the parties to justify continuing the trial highlighted the testimonies of fellow inmates from the penitentiary where Myrta was held in preventive detention. They pointed out that Myrta dedicated all her time to taking care of her appearance and never showed remorse or sadness for how she had acted against her own daughter. They also presented a psychological profile of the accused, indicating to the court that she did not understand empathy but was very familiar with manipulation, as she had provided details and information from the beginning to distort her actions and divert suspicions that arose around her. They stated that Myrta was a person with a preserved reality judgment, aware of the illegality of her acts and the consequences of her actions. This made her culpable as she presented a personality disorder but no loss of contact with reality. Awaiting trial, the regional prosecutor announced he would request life imprisonment for Myrta. For Luis, he would seek a sentence of more than 20 years in prison. On January 21, 2023, just before the trial began, Myrta was urgently transferred from jail to the hospital due to complications from kidney stones. Her hospitalization became public through a photo leaked on social media, prompting criticism from the defense team for the lack of privacy for their client. 3 days after a successful operation, she was discharged and returned to prison. Given the extreme gravity of the events and the fact that they involved a minor, the Child Rights Defense Office requested that the hearings be conducted without media presence. During the last preparatory hearing for the trial, the defense attorney focused on the absence of genetic material to dismiss the accusations against Luis. Ultimately, considering the evidence presented by the public prosecutor's office insufficient, the court dismissed the charges, and instead of preventive detention, Luis was placed under house arrest with a prohibition on leaving the country. Despite this decision, he still had to face a trial. Myrta was not as fortunate. Despite her lawyer's efforts, the highest judicial authority determined she should remain in preventive detention. The trial for Melissa's case took place on April 23, 2023. Presenting a detailed chronology of the events leading to the tragic outcome, the prosecutor asserted that all evidence pointed unequivocally to Myrta, a woman whose jealousy led her to see a rival in her own daughter. To support her case, security camera footage was exhibited in court. The defense criticized what they considered a lack of thoroughness in the investigation, arguing that other leads that could have led to the real culprit and not Myrta were not sufficiently explored. The defense attorneys requested that the court consider their client's substantial cooperation since the beginning of the investigation, initially as witnesses and later as defendants. They proposed a sentence of 10 years for homicide and 5 for arson for Myrta, and a 3-year and 1-day prison sentence for Luis. However, both the public prosecutor and the case advocates opposed all the requests. On May 17, 2023, in a unanimous decision, the court found Luis and Myrta guilty of the charged crimes. Following the verdict, the prosecutors thanked the support of civil society and the entities involved in the investigation, including the experts from the forensic laboratory. On May 27, 2023, the court sentenced Myrta to 33 years in prison, 18 for homicide, and 15 for being the author of a consummated arson. Luis Santander was sentenced to 10 years and 1 day for repeated sexual abuse of Melissa Chavez and was prohibited from engaging in activities involving minors. The case deeply shocked Chilean society, and though the sentences could not reverse the irreparable loss of Melissa and the life she could have had, they brought some consolation to the community with the effective action of the judiciary. A young son, a devoted brother, a first-generation Irish American. He excelled in academics, thrived as an athlete, and was tirelessly studying to conquer the grueling CPA exam. Chad O'Melia was the embodiment of every parent's dream, but in a shocking twist of fate, this golden boy was found brutally murdered, stabbed over 100 times. What dark forces had turned his promising life into a horrific nightmare? Chad Brandon O'Melia was born on September 27, 1991, in Santa Clarita, a city located north of Los Angeles, California. His father, Sean O'Melia, an Irish construction supervisor, and his mother, Michelle, separated when Chad was just 5 years old. Despite their separation, They worked hard to ensure Chad had a happy childhood. According to those close to him, Chad was a kind young man with a bright smile and boundless energy. He had a great sense of humor and was always responsible and dedicated. His friends saw him as the big brother of the group, always looking out for them without expecting anything in return. Chad developed a passion for American football at a young age and played throughout his teenage years. He continued playing while attending Chico State University, where he studied accounting and eventually graduated. After graduation, Chad moved to an apartment in Thousand Oaks, part of the greater Los Angeles area, taking his dog Athena with him. He shared the apartment with a young man named Vinny Oliveira. Alongside working at an accounting firm, Chad was studying to obtain his Certified Public Accountant (CPA) certificate. However, his busy days left him with insufficient sleep at night, leading him to develop a habit of using cannabis to help him sleep. According to Vinny, Chad was often intoxicated when seen at the apartment. Chad didn't hide this from others, and even his parents were aware of his cannabis use. Although they didn't approve, they didn't see it as the worst thing he could be doing. Sean explained in an interview that Chad never smoked when visiting him because he knew Sean disliked it. Sean considered cannabis a dirty substance with a foul smell that changed Chad's personality and decreased his motivation and concentration. Little did Sean expect that Chad's addiction to cannabis would dramatically change his life, all because of a woman he barely knew. Bryn Spoicher was born on January 25, 1991 in Chicago, Illinois. From a very young age, Bryn faced serious health issues that required numerous surgeries and strong medications. These medical procedures and medications severely deteriorated her hearing. At 4 years old, she began using cochlear implants to hear better and also learned to read lips. Her medical condition made her feel isolated and different from others. Throughout her schooling, she was often the only student with hearing loss and would hide her hearing aids to fit in and avoid teasing. As she grew older, she decided to turn this aspect of herself that once embarrassed her into a strength. Bryn pursued a doctorate in audiology at the University of Washington School of Medicine, graduating in the 2010 S. She excelled in her field, with one professor stating that out of the thousands of graduate students he had taught, Bryn stood out as brilliant, and none could surpass her. In August 2017, at the age of 26, Bryn moved to Thousand Oaks and secured a job as an audiologist at UCLA Health, a health system comprising various medical centers, including the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. For almost a year, she lived in a rental apartment that didn't allow pets, so she had to leave her Siberian husky, Arya, with her family in Illinois. It wasn't until April 2018 that she found a place where she could bring her beloved canine companion. Having Arya by her side again significantly improved Bryn's daily life, as she had trained the dog as a service animal 2 years earlier when Arya was just a puppy. Bryn often took Arya for walks at Conejo Creek, a popular park in Thousand Oaks. It was there, at her favorite spot, that she met Chad in late April 2018. According to her account, Chad was the one who initially approached her. On several occasions when their paths crossed, the 26-year-old Chad asked for her phone number, but she declined each time. Eventually, Chad handed her his business card so she could text him if she ever wanted to meet up. That's exactly what Bryn did, and soon they began an informal relationship. They would go out to eat or hang out with friends, and once, they shared a bottle of Irish whiskey while watching their dogs play in the park. Bryn was drawn to Chad's sarcastic humor, which contrasted with his kind and sweet personality. She expressed that although she wasn't sure they'd get along at first, she soon realized they fit together like puzzle pieces. On Sunday, May 27, 2018, the day before Memorial Day, Bryn went out drinking with some friends. Chad contacted her later, inviting her to visit. Around 10:30 p.m., the 27-year-old Bryn arrived at Chad's place with Arya. They spent time together, drinking a bit and chatting with Chad's roommate, Vinny. Shortly after midnight, Chad took out his water pipe and loaded it with cannabis. He went out to the balcony to smoke alone, but Bryn soon joined him and asked for a hit. After inhaling, all she felt was a burning sensation in her throat, which made her cough. She told Chad that she had never had good experiences with cannabis, as she never felt its effects as others described. Surprised, Chad loaded the pipe again with even more cannabis, encouraging her to try again to feel the effects. Bryn complied and smoked again. What happened next was so horrific it seemed like fiction. In the early hours of May 28th, the Thousand Oaks police responded to an emergency call made by Vinny. Something terrible was happening at the residence and they needed immediate help. When officers arrived, their body cameras captured
the violent scene unfolding inside the apartment. Bryn had savagely attacked Chad with several sharp objects taken from the kitchen and then turned one on herself. The footage is so graphic it has not been released to the public. In an attempt to stop her, officers fired a taser 4 times, but Bryn seemed unaffected by the electric shocks.
They then used their batons, striking her 9 times until she finally dropped the weapon. Bryn suffered 5 fractures in one arm and deep cuts on her neck, face, and right hand. She had also attacked her dog, Arya, who fortunately survived. Tragically, Chad was not as lucky. By the time police arrived, he was already lifeless on the floor, with a total of 108 wounds across his body, as later revealed by the forensic report. Bryn was rushed to the hospital and immediately taken into surgery to save her life. The procedure was successful, and she was admitted to the same health center for recovery. Investigators wasted no time and questioned Bryn as soon as she regained consciousness. Still intubated and unable to speak. She responded in writing, briefly recounting that she had told Chad she didn't want to smoke anymore, but he had forced her to do so. This response led detectives to believe that Bryn did not remember her actions, a revelation they decided to share with her a few days later. Once Bryn had sufficiently recovered from her injuries, she was arrested and charged with homicide. The aftermath of the incident impacted not only Bryn, but also her victim and their families. It was Chad's father, Sean, who had to break the tragic news to his ex-wife, Michelle. In an interview, the grieving father chose not to disclose how he delivered the news, as the memory was too painful to revisit. However, he did share that he requested the police allow him to personally inform Michelle, wanting to be there to console and support her. He recalled seeing the moment her soul shattered as he spoke the words. From that moment, Michelle fell into deep depression. Sean reflected that losing a child brings overwhelming guilt and makes one doubt if happiness is ever possible again. This was Michelle's experience, compounded by her type 2 diabetes. After the funeral, she felt she had no right to smile. She refused to let loved ones take photos of her looking happy, believing it would be disrespectful to her mourning and her son. This mindset led her to neglect her health, ceasing her medical treatment. 18 months after Chad's death, Michelle passed away from severe cardiac dysfunction. Tragically, she did not live to see the conclusion of Bryn's trial. Though it's impossible to know, it's likely the delay between the last hearing and the sentencing of the person responsible for her son's death would have caused her even more pain. Sean explained in later interviews that shortly after the legal proceedings against Bryn began, he started receiving notifications that the defense had requested extensions, claiming they needed more time to prepare for trial. These messages arrived at least every 6 months. This situation dragged on for over 5 years, also impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Thus, the first trial hearing did not occur until November 9, 2023. During this initial proceeding, Bryn, fully recovered from her injuries, had the opportunity to testify before the jury and those present in the courtroom. The then 32-year-old woman, equipped with a real-time transcription monitor on both the witness stand and the defendant's bench, shared her story. Bryn recounted her life before describing the events of May 27, 2018. She stated that after encouraging her to smoke a second time, Chad got up to fetch the water pipe. Once loaded, he brought it to her face, insisting she inhale immediately to feel the effects. Bryn explained she felt she couldn't refuse him, admitting he hadn't used physical force, but his persistence frightened her. She revealed that Chad did not always exhibit the sweet demeanor others attributed to him, and that she had seen him in bad moods, which pressured her into compliance. According to Bryn, minutes later she began to feel as if they were trapped in a time loop. The conversation with Chad seemed to repeat endlessly, giving her a constant sense of déjà vu. She lost the ability to form coherent sentences, which caused her anxiety. Seeking relief, she went back inside, lay down on the couch, and closed her eyes to calm herself. She then reported hearing voices in her head and seeing things with her eyes closed that were clearly not there, all while feeling trapped in a never-ending cycle. At some point, Bryn felt she had died, believing she was trapped inside her own corpse. She described seeing and hearing her loved ones mourning her, even feeling hands touching her body. This wasn't the most bizarre experience of that night. She claimed to have had an out-of-body experience, seeing her own body lying on the couch from above. She added that Chad was beside her, crying uncontrollably, and paramedics were attempting to revive her. Before continuing, Bryn clarified that what happened next felt as if she were in a movie, viewing events from the perspective of one of the characters, as if it were happening to someone else, not her. She recounted pushing the chairs aside in the apartment to make her way to the kitchen, where she grabbed 2 knives and threw them forcefully at Chad. She then took 2 more knives and approached one of the dogs, attacking it. Bryn thought she heard Chad ask why she had hurt Athena, but later learned it was Arya. She then walked to where Chad was standing, and just as she raised the knife against him, she lost consciousness completely. Despite this, she continued hearing voices in her head, urging her not to stop. She also heard Vinny, who ran out of the apartment to call the authorities. The hallucinations persisted for what felt like hours, becoming so intense that she ended up cutting her own neck with the knife. After that, everything went black again. Eventually, Bryn regained consciousness, though not fully and not for long. It was not a slow, gradual process, but quite the opposite. She felt the electric shocks from the police taser used to make her drop the knife, and in her delirium, she thought they were using a defibrillator to resuscitate her. She recalled waking up in the hospital when authorities began asking her about what had happened. However, her memories were blurry, and she couldn't distinguish what was real from what she had hallucinated. It wasn't until 2 days later that investigators informed her she had killed Chad. The defense attorney referenced tests conducted on the water pipe after the incident and called another person to explain the results. The expert stated that drug detection tests are not 100% reliable, as some substances might not be immediately identifiable. He asserted that while the report clearly indicated the presence of THC, the main psychoactive component of cannabis, there was a significant possibility the weed had been laced with something else. This was even more probable if Chad had purchased it from an illegal vendor, who might add other substances to enhance effects and reduce costs, despite recreational marijuana being legal in California at that time. Bryn's legal team also highlighted that until then, it had been overlooked that Vinny, Chad's roommate, had smoked the same substance earlier and also experienced hallucinations. Based on this, Bryn's defense portrayed her as an innocent woman with little experience in substance use, who couldn't have known what she was smoking when coerced into it. This was corroborated by testimonies from her acquaintances. Old friends from high school testified that she was never interested in drugs, which was why she had cut ties with some people. A 33-year-old woman named Amy Carrowick, who met Bryn in 2007, mentioned they bonded over shared interests in high school. She noted that while Bryn played basketball, she played softball, and they both enjoyed activities typically unpopular among girls like camping and hiking. Bryn first smoked marijuana in 2014 when she started dating a man named Kevin, with whom she had a 3-year relationship. The couple took a joint to a mountain campsite in Washington and decided after smoking that it wasn't for them. Kevin, a personal trainer and ex-Marine, believed Chad could have coerced her into smoking that night. He explained that they broke up in 2017 when Bryn moved to California, but described her as carefree, charismatic, and pleasant. It was logical for the defense attorneys to base their strategy on these arguments, as California's penal code stipulates that individuals under the influence of drugs or alcohol are fully responsible for their actions unless they were forced or deceived into intoxication. Despite their efforts, the jury ultimately rejected this argument. The statement Bryn had given to the police while still hospitalized became the primary issue facing the prosecutor and the defense. The accused had initially provided a written statement confessing that she had voluntarily taken the second hit from Chad's pipe. She claimed this document had been concealed from the prosecution for a time. Moreover, in one of the hearings, the prosecutor unveiled new evidence that could potentially turn the trial around. She portrayed Bryn in a starkly different light than the defense did, supporting her argument with a series of text messages exchanged in 2018 between Bryn and several friends. In these communications, Bryn referenced getting so drunk that she had to miss work the next day and mentioned consuming cannabis-infused foods. This served as a basis for the prosecutor to question not only Bryn's original statement, but also all her testimonies. The prosecutor emphasized that Bryn had not mentioned to investigators or doctors that she had been pressured or intimidated during most of her interviews. Bryn responded to both allegations. She explained that she tended to exaggerate her experiences when talking to friends, but had never been so drunk as to black out or miss work due to a hangover. She added that she had only been late to work once after a night out drinking. Regarding the interrogations, Bryn stated she hadn't shared all the information with the police in each interview because she assumed the detectives already knew everything after repeating the same answers multiple times. To counter the prosecution's claims, the defense hired mental health experts who determined that Bryn had not suffered from any mental illness, problems, or violent tendencies before the attack, suggesting that a marijuana-induced psychotic episode was the only explanation for her actions. This argument undermined the prosecutor's case, leading the jury to reduce the charge. On December 1st, 2023, after 4 hours of deliberation, Bryn was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter instead of the initial charge of murder. The verdict was a shock to the victim's family and friends. On January 22, 2024, the day before the sentencing hearing, they gathered in front of the county government building, demanding a sentence fitting the severity of Bryn's crimes. On January 23, 2024, the courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, and family members. The room was so crowded that staff had to place people in the jury box and even had some standing in the aisle. Amid sobs, Bryn took the stand one last time to apologize to Chad's family, especially his father, who had endured the ordeal without the support of Chad's mother. However, the most emotional moment of the hearing came when Chad's paternal grandmother read a statement she had written. The elderly woman addressed Bryn, expressing forgiveness for what she had done, adding that if she couldn't forgive her, God wouldn't forgive her either. After nearly 6 years of waiting, the judge sentenced Bryn to 2 years of probation instead of the 5 years in prison she faced after being found guilty in December 2023. As part of her punishment, she was required to complete 100 hours of community service to raise awareness about cannabis-induced psychosis. She was warned that violating the terms of her probation could result in imprisonment. Following the verdict, Sean criticized the judge for what he perceived as a biased decision influenced by the defendant's gender and race. He also expressed concern about the message this decision sent regarding marijuana use, feeling it gave consumers a green light to justify illegal actions. Lastly, he suggested that Bryn should be hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation to study her brain's unique chemistry, believing that the drug alone wasn't the sole cause of the alleged psychotic episode and hoping an investigation might clarify it. The prosecutor voiced her concerns about the precedent set by the judge's decision, describing the sentence as a mockery of the criminal justice system. She considered this case, marked as involuntary manslaughter, one of the most atrocious and violent cases in her 29-year career seeking justice. The tragic end of Chad and the lenient sentence given to Bryn sparked a debate on recreational cannabis use. A famous forensic psychiatrist noted that the increasing acceptance of cannabis in society led to misinformation about its associated risks. He pointed to various studies showing a clear link between cannabis use and psychosis, though he admitted it doesn't occur in 100% of cases. As the legal system faced criticism for its handling of the case, society reflected on the risks associated with cannabis use, questioning whether marijuana is truly a catalyst for violence or merely a trigger among a broader set of circumstances or pre-existing medical conditions. On a quiet October afternoon in 2005, a tragic accident shattered the lives of everyone involved. 14-month-old Kyle Lazercik was found unresponsive in his home, his tiny body marked with mysterious injuries. The young nanny, Ada Quadros, frantically dialed 911, but what happened next would change her life forever. As paramedics raced to the scene, the grim reality of Kyle's condition became evident. Despite Ada's desperate attempts to save him, the baby's injuries were severe. But what could have caused such a tragedy? The answers seemed elusive. Ada Quadros was born on September 13, 1977, in the coastal town of Chimbote, Peru. She was the first child of Victor Quadros, a veterinarian, and Luz Fernandez, a teacher. Ada was the eldest of 4 siblings and consistently excelled academically, even winning knowledge contests. She had a happy childhood filled with dreams of self-improvement. Ada later recounted that she spent much of her childhood with one of her sisters on their grandparents' farm, enjoying the close connection with nature and animals. This period was one of the happiest times of her life. Although Ada's family wasn't poor, they were not wealthy either. During her teenage years, she looked for ways to contribute financially. Together with her sister and a friend, she formed a group to entertain at children's parties. After high school, Ada enrolled in a private university to study law. Unfortunately, her financial situation did not allow her to continue, and she had to drop out. Despite this setback, Ada was determined to succeed and support her family. With this goal in mind, she applied for a U.S. visa through the lottery program. Like many young people from Peru and other Latin American countries, Ada saw the United States as a land of opportunities. She was determined to move there, work hard, earn a better income, and pave the way for a brighter future for herself and her family. Her family was thrilled for her. They sold some belongings and did everything possible to gather enough money for her journey. Her destination was Texas, where she initially planned to stay with some relatives. In early 2004, she began working as a waitress in a restaurant. After some time, she joined a company that placed nannies in households. This is how she met the Lazercik family. The Lazercik family consisted of Father Michael, commonly known as Mike, Mother Renee, their eldest daughter Alyssa, and twin boys Ryan and Kyle. Little is known about the family's background except that they married in 2000. Shortly after their wedding, Renee became pregnant with their first daughter, Alyssa. Just 4 months after Alyssa's birth, Renee was expecting again, this time with twins Kyle and Ryan. The Lazercik couple wanted to hire a trustworthy nanny to take care of the twins when Renee returned to work. Alyssa was already comfortable in a daycare she attended daily, where she had made several friends, so they decided she would continue going there. The couple interviewed several candidates, and Ada stood out as the best option. At 27 years old, she was young but not a teenager. She appeared healthy, strong, well-mannered, and cheerful. Renee wanted Ada to start immediately so she could spend a few weeks with her, explaining the household routines, where things were, and what was expected of her. She also wanted to observe how Ada handled the young twins, who were just over a year old. The family had one specific request. They needed assurance that Ada could commit to staying with them for 18 months, and Ada committed to this arrangement. Initially, it was agreed that she would only spend the day at the Lazercik household, but after some time, they asked her to live in, and Ada agreed. From then on, she only left on weekends to stay at her uncle's house. Everything seemed to go smoothly. The Lazercik family was pleased with Ada's work and grew fond of her, trusting her completely. Numerous photos captured happy moments with the smiling young nanny holding the twins. However, everything changed in the summer of 2005. Ada informed the Lazercik family that her uncles were returning to Peru before moving on to Germany. Ada was prepared to go with them and had already purchased her plane ticket for October 29th of that year. Understandably, this was disappointing news for the couple since it was not what they had agreed upon. Eventually, they understood and only asked Ada to stay until they could find a replacement. They even requested her help in searching for and selecting her successor. Ada agreed, but from that point on, she no longer stayed overnight at the Lazercik home. Instead, she returned to her uncle's house each night and came back early in the morning. Given the change in circumstances and Ada's impending departure, the Lazercik family scheduled interviews with several nanny candidates for Wednesday, October 12th. During the day, Renee called Ada and asked her to prepare macaroni and cheese for the children. Ada complied and fed the kids. When Renee returned home, she greeted her children, saw they were well, and after interviewing the candidates, spent over an hour with her little ones before they went to bed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, at 5 a.m. on Thursday, October 13th, Kyle woke up crying, which was unusual. The twins were typically heavy sleepers and never woke up on their own. It always took someone to wake them. Nonetheless, Renee got up, went to the twins' room, picked up Kyle, and soothed him until he fell back asleep. She then returned to bed. 2 hours later, at 7:30, Mike went to the children's room, woke them up, hugged and kissed them, and left them in Ada's care before heading to work. Renee woke up just before 9:30 and spent some time with the twins. She changed Ryan's diaper, said goodbye to both him and Kyle, and left for work. The children were fine, with nothing out of the ordinary except Kyle's early wake-up. That day, their older sister Alyssa went to daycare as usual. But things took a dramatic turn around 1 p.m. when Ada called 911, highly agitated, saying that one of the children, Kyle, had stopped breathing and was turning blue. After providing the address, the operator gave Ada instructions to perform CPR on the child. Ada followed the instructions while paramedics were on their way. A few minutes later, they arrived at the house and took over Kyle's care. They asked Ada what had happened, and she, very distressed, explained that after lunch, she had put Kyle in his crib and returned to get his brother. But when she got back with Ryan, Kyle started vomiting and stopped breathing. While paramedics attended to Kyle, Ada called Renee to inform her of the situation, giving her a different version of events. She said that after feeding the children, she took Kyle out of his high chair and, as usual, placed him on the playroom floor while she fetched his brother. But when she returned, Kyle was vomiting. She went to the kitchen to get a bowl to catch the vomit, and when she returned, Kyle had fallen. She said she picked him up, took him to the sink, and performed the maneuver Renee had taught her in case one of the children stopped breathing. But it didn't work, and she also attempted CPR. After initial treatment, the paramedics transported Kyle to the nearest hospital. When Renee arrived at the house, the ambulance with her son had already left, but the police were still at the scene. Renee took Ryan, the other twin, and asked Ada to accompany them. They followed the police, who escorted them to the hospital. During the drive, Renee called her husband and they met at the medical center. A few minutes later, the doctors decided to transfer Kyle by helicopter to the Dallas Children's Hospital. The Lazerciks returned home, left Ada to care for Ryan, and headed to the Dallas Children's Hospital. Ada asked them to keep her informed about Kyle's condition. On the way to the hospital, Renee started worrying that Ada might be too nervous to look after Ryan properly, so she called a friend to assist the nanny at the house. Shortly after, her friend arrived at the house. Ada, visibly distressed and crying, opened the door for her. She asked Ada to explain what had happened. According to her account, Ada said that Kyle was standing between the playroom and the kitchen when he suddenly collapsed. Ada claimed she dropped a plate she was holding, picked Kyle up, took him to the living room, and performed CPR on him. She recalled Ada mentioning that Kyle's brain hadn't fully developed and that this issue had started at birth. She didn't fully understand, but Ada kept talking, saying she loved Kyle and would never hurt him. She tried to calm the very upset nanny, reassuring her that she hadn't done anything wrong and that she was a good person. Meanwhile, at the Dallas Children's Hospital, the Lazercik family received devastating news. The doctor in charge of Kyle reported that the child had suffered severe head injuries, with multiple bruises on his head, arm, and left shoulder. A neurosurgeon met with the distressed parents to explain that something had to be done to relieve the pressure on Kyle's brain, though survival was unlikely. A child abuse specialist who also met with Mike and Renee suggested that Kyle's injuries could be consistent with abuse. The specialist stated that Kyle's injuries were so severe, it was as if he had been in a car accident or fallen from a 6th floor. Initially, Renee couldn't believe it. She thought Ada might have accidentally dropped the child or was too scared or ashamed to admit it. But the doctors clearly explained the extent of Kyle's head injuries and the force required to cause them. With this information, the possibility of an accident seemed implausible. Renee immediately called another friend to pick up Ryan and take him away from the house. While this was happening at the hospital, Ada became increasingly anxious at home. Renee's friend had to leave to pick up her son from school and take him home. During her absence, Ada called her several times, asking if there was any news about Kyle. When Renee's friend returned to the house, she found Ada calm. Ada was no longer crying or talking. Shortly after, a police car drove by the house. Upon seeing it, Ada lost her composure. She began crying uncontrollably and shouting, "No, no, no." She collapsed to the floor behind a door, repeatedly insisting she would never harm Kyle. Two female detectives arrived to interview Ada as the person who had called 911 about the injured child. She had been the only adult present when the incident occurred. As the detectives located the house and got out of their patrol car, they heard Ada's cries. Upon entering, they found her extremely agitated. When Ada was able to speak, she explained that she had taken Kyle out of his high chair and placed him on the playroom floor. She was patting his back to help him burp when he suddenly began to vomit. Ada said she went to the kitchen to get a container to catch the vomit, as Renee disliked stains on the floor. While she was cleaning, Kyle turned blue, fell, and started convulsing. She claimed she took him to the living room, called 911, and followed the dispatcher's instructions. During the interview, the other officer called the hospital to get an update on Kyle's condition. When they discovered the diagnosis, detectives told Ada that her story did not account for the injuries Kyle had. Ada suggested that Kyle might have hit his head when he fell after she left him alone in the playroom. But the officers noted that the playroom floor was covered with soft rugs, making this explanation unlikely. Trying to offer another explanation, Ada said that Kyle might have hit his head on the door frame when she carried him on her hip. At the officer's insistence, Ada demonstrated how Kyle could have been hurt and mentioned that Mike and Renee often bumped Kyle's head without any problems. The officer checked the spot where Ada claimed Kyle hit his head but found no evidence of a strong impact. When the officers told her that the injury didn't seem severe enough to cause the extensive damage the doctors described, Ada insisted that the impact was strong because she was running with Kyle in her arms. She also stated that she had never shaken or hit either of the twins. The officers urged Ada to tell the truth, as it could save Kyle's life, but Ada provided no further explanation. Given the circumstances, the officers reported the situation to their command and took Ada into preventive custody for further questioning. Meanwhile, crime scene investigation units arrived to examine the house. After completing their task, they informed Renee's friend, who had stayed at the house on behalf of the owners, that they could clean up and organize everything for the family's return. While several friends cleaned the house, they found a piece of adhesive tape sticking out from the door of a cabinet under the kitchen island. When they opened the door, they noticed it was broken and held together by tape. As a result, opening it caused the door to become misaligned. They simply placed it back and secured it with the tape, but found it strange because Renee was always careful with broken items to prevent the children from getting hurt. They had a hunch and called the police to report the door. Shortly after, investigators returned to collect potential evidence. Later, when questioned about the cabinet door, Renee stated that she frequently used that door and had never seen it held with adhesive tape. By Friday, October 14th, all of Mike and Renee's hopes had vanished. The doctors informed them that Kyle was brain dead and had no chance of recovery. Amid indescribable pain, the couple authorized the removal of life support, after which Kyle passed away. 3 days later, on October 17th, the detectives interviewed Ada in prison, where she was accused of premeditated assault on a minor. This time, Ada claimed that the day before the incident, she was preparing the macaroni and cheese that Renee had requested. She had Kyle sitting on the kitchen counter, and the child fell, landing headfirst on the kitchen floor and hitting his head hard. Ada said she picked him up and checked for injuries. The only thing she noticed was redness on his ear and the right side of his head, so she applied cold compresses and gave him a pain reliever. When the interrogators asked why she hadn't told this to the other officers, Ada said she thought they wouldn't believe her. She mentioned that she didn't tell Renee because when she arrived home from work, she complained of a severe headache. Ada said Renee suffered from migraines and had requested that the lights be turned off and the house be kept quiet. The interrogators asked if she had fallen with the child, which she adamantly denied. During that interrogation, Ada learned that Kyle had died, and she cried for the rest of the interview. Ada was brought before the courts, where a judge charged her with aggravated homicide and set bail at $750,000, which was beyond the means of Ada or her family, so she remained in custody until the trial. At that time, the police indicated that she might be charged with premeditated actions, which could carry the death penalty. The case of Kyle's death went to trial in the second half of 2005. The doctor who examined Kyle at Dallas Children's Hospital testified that when he received Kyle, the child was already unconscious. He described multiple hematomas on the right side of Kyle's head, as well as bruises on the left side of his head and shoulder and both arms. Additionally, there were 2 small hemorrhages forming hematomas on the right temple. Kyle had 3 main areas of hematomas on his head, indicating 3 separate impacts. He added that the bruises were relatively recent, one possibly 12 to 16 hours old. Internally, Kyle had brain and retinal bleeding, indicative of severe trauma, even though there were no broken bones. The brain tissue was notably swollen, and the pressure inside Kyle's head was 90 millimeters of mercury, whereas the normal level is 20 millimeters. Based on these findings, he concluded that Kyle had suffered severe traumatic events consistent with blunt force trauma, possibly from someone hitting his head against a hard object. He suggested the type of injuries could result from shaking and swinging a young child's head against a solid object, like a kitchen cabinet door. A Dallas County forensic expert testified that the autopsy revealed multiple, overlapping small hematomas on Kyle's scalp, along with a couple of punctate abrasions on the right temple, separated by over a centimeter. There were also 4 or 5 pairs of similar lesions on his head. His brain showed significant hemorrhage and swelling, with retinal hemorrhages in both eyes, requiring substantial force to cause such injuries. She concluded that the cause of death was severe head injuries from blunt force trauma, agreeing that Kyle's head might have been struck multiple times against the wooden door of the kitchen cabinet. She ruled out the possibility that Kyle had merely bumped into a door frame or fallen from the kitchen counter. Another critical testimony came from a forensic analyst who measured the distance between the fasteners on the broken kitchen cabinet door and found it matched the punctate abrasions on Kyle's head. This expert also analyzed the adhesive tape used to repair the cabinet door and discovered 2 DNA traces, one of which had a much higher contribution and matched Ada's DNA. The lesser trace could not be identified. After hearing from the experts, it was Mike's turn to testify. He stated that Kyle was fine on the night of October 12th and the morning of October 13th with no bruises. He also mentioned that he prepared breakfast that morning, opening and closing the kitchen cabinet doors to get utensils and food, and that all doors were in perfect condition, including the one later found inexplicably repaired with tape. The parents shared that they had breakfast with the children and played with blocks, with the twins crawling around a playhouse. Based on all the evidence, it was easy to conclude that the events leading to Kyle's death occurred when no other adults were in the house except Ada. The case prosecutor stated that the exact circumstances of what happened to Kyle might never be known for sure, but based on the evidence presented at trial, she painted a possible scenario. Perhaps Kyle didn't want to eat his lunch, and Ada, feeling frustrated or distracted by watching a soap opera, might have taken him out of his high chair without noticing the cabinet door was open. The prosecutor speculated that Ada's rage might have triggered the vicious attack on Kyle's head using the cabinet door until it broke, with the door's screws leaving marks on the child. After all the testimonies and closing arguments, the jury went to deliberate. Upon returning, they found Ada Quadros guilty of capital murder of a child under 6 years old. As the verdict was read, Ada's mother, Luz Fernandez, who had traveled from Peru when her daughter was arrested, stood up and shouted that she would free Ada because she was innocent. She proclaimed that there was no evidence to convict her daughter and vowed to start over and appeal. After the jury members left, Kyle's parents showed photographs and videos of their deceased son, recounting his brief 14 months of life from birth to the last photo taken days before his death. Family members spoke about Kyle, while others simply couldn't stop crying. Ada was sentenced the following year in 2006 to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Ada and her family, giving up was not an option. Her parents immediately started a campaign to appeal the sentence, arguing that Ada's conviction was based on racial prejudice and ineffective public defense. However, appealing required money for legal representation and process costs, which the family did not have. Undeterred, they sought support from various sources, including the Peruvian government, the Peruvian and Latino communities in the United States, and solidarity organizations in Peru. In prison, Ada maintained her innocence and took every opportunity for interviews to assert it. Their persistence paid off, and in 2009, Ada's legal representation filed an appeal, citing 5 specific errors in the initial trial. After reviewing the case, the appeals court dismissed 3 of the claims but agreed with 2. This was enough for the judges to overturn the conviction and annul the trial due to irregularities. Following this decision, Ada's family began another fundraising effort to cover the $100,000 needed for a new trial. It took another 3 years to prepare for the new trial, which began on July 10, 2012, with the selection of 12 jurors from over 100 candidates. The trial took place in Collin County's Justice Hall. The defense argued that Kyle had fallen from the kitchen counter on October 12th, injuring his head, and the situation worsened the next day when Ada, running with the child in her arms, accidentally struck his head on the doorframe. This time, the defense presented testimony from a forensic expert with 40 years of experience. He suggested that some of Kyle's bruises might have been caused at the hospital during catheter insertion to assess brain swelling. The prosecution fiercely challenged this testimony. David Gardner, an employee of the kitchen cabinet manufacturer, also testified for the defense. He proposed alternative explanations for the broken cabinet door, though he didn't entirely rule out that Kyle's head could have been struck against it. A poignant moment in the trial was Mike's testimony, where he described Kyle's last 2 days connected to numerous tubes and machines, eventually being taken off life support and dying in his parents' arms. The defense argued there wasn't enough evidence to convict Ada, but the prosecution highlighted the medical findings and the numerous times Ada changed her story. After the sessions concluded, the jury deliberated for 5 hours, even requesting to listen to the 911 call recordings again. Ultimately, they once again found Ada Quadros, then 33, guilty of capital murder and sentenced her to life imprisonment without parole. Back in prison, Ada joined the prison volleyball team, learned Braille, and won an art contest with a drawing of the Virgin Mary, which she auctioned to raise funds for a new appeal. Ada, from her cell, maintains her innocence, her spirit unbroken as she and her family continue their fight for an appeal, seeking a chance to prove what they believe to be the truth. 17-year-old Rudy Farias was reported missing by his mother in 2015, adding to a series of family tragedies. In 2011, Rudy witnessed his brother's death in a car accident, and in 2014, his father took his own life. When Rudy disappeared, it seemed like another misfortune had befallen the family. However, on June 29, 2023, Rudy was found alive. Investigators soon discovered that Rudy had never actually been missing. He had been living at home with his mother the entire time. He had even spoken to police over the years using a fake name. This case has raised many questions. Why did his mother report him missing? What was Rudy doing during those 8 years? Why did he use a false identity? And why did it take so long for the truth to come out? Rudolph Farias, known to everyone as Rudy, was born in Houston, Texas. He lived with his mother, Janie Santana, and his older brother Charles, who was from Janie's previous relationship. Janie had been married to another man for 10 years. Rudy's father, also named Rudolph Farias, was a veteran officer from the Houston police who remained distant, having another family with 5 more children. For Rudy, his older brother was a crucial figure in his upbringing. Rudy once shared on Facebook how important Charles was to him. He recounted how, during his time at school, he was often teased for being small and skinny. But whenever things got tough, Charles would step in to defend and protect him. Charles was more than just a brother. He was Rudy's best friend and father figure. However, Rudy sometimes felt a tinge of jealousy because Charles had a good relationship with his father, who often visited and took Charles out, bringing back cool toys or Happy Meal surprises from McDonald's. According to Rudy, Charles noticed his sadness and one day talked to him, acknowledging Rudy's hurt over not seeing his father. Charles promised he would always be there for Rudy and never abandon him. The brothers grew up inseparable, relying on each other under the strict and unstable supervision of their mother, Janie. To explain Janie's instability, judicial records show she had used at least 5 different surnames over the years, including Diaz, Rodriguez, Farias, and Ortega. The records also indicate that Jenny had been married several times, with at least one marriage annulled because one of her ex-partners claimed she was married to 2 other people simultaneously. She also had a history of minor criminal offenses, such as public disorder on November 22, 1994, inappropriate conduct with a loaded firearm in 1996, and driving without a license with a minor, presumed to be Rudy, in 2020. Additionally, she had been arrested for speeding and driving under the influence. Janie also created social media accounts on platforms like TikTok and Facebook, using photos that were not hers. According to different sources, Janie once stole pictures of a country singer to use on a fake profile. Despite the tumultuous household, there was always pride for the eldest son, Charles. He benefited from his father's financial support but remained humble and down to earth. Charles was an excellent brother, son, and student. He graduated from high school in 2007 and was accepted into the U.S. Marine Corps, with training set to begin on March 21, 2011. At 21, Charles dreamed of serving his country, but his life was tragically cut short in a motorcycle accident on February 13, 2011. Charles's sudden and tragic death profoundly impacted the family. Rudy, who was 13 at the time, expressed his grief on Facebook, detailing the events of that fateful day. He recounted how they woke up together that morning, and Charles asked Rudy to help him get the motorcycle out of the garage. After preparing, Charles left to meet friends, marking the last time Rudy saw his brother alive. A family friend called later that day to inform them that Charles had been in an accident and his body was lying on the pavement. Rudy and Janie rushed to the scene. Rudy recalled that at first, he couldn't see his brother. Then he saw his mother on the ground, holding Charles and pleading with God to bring her son back. Rudy described how he froze, staring at his brother lifeless on the ground. This state of shock stayed with him for a long time. He told his loved ones that he found it difficult to even say the word death. He preferred to think that his brother had fallen asleep forever and often said he would soon meet Charles in heaven. At Charles's military funeral, Rudy delivered an emotional speech expressing how much he would miss his brother, who was the closest thing he had to a father. He shared that Charles taught him many things, but not how to live without him. The following years were tough for Janie and Rudy. The void left by Charles was a heavy burden to bear. Rudy began experiencing recurrent episodes of post-traumatic stress and depression. He even started self-harming, scratching his wrists with sharp objects like aluminum cans. On August 19, 2014, 3 years after his brother's death, Rudy received news that his father, aged 51, had also died tragically. The lifeless body of Rudy's father was found in his uniform inside his patrol car. He had parked in a secluded area outside Houston, where he decided to take his own life using his service weapon. The police report on the incident revealed that shortly before, he had been relieved of his duties pending an internal affairs investigation. Rudolph had been with the Houston Police Department since May 1993. A police spokesperson detailed that Rudolph was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation into criminal conduct allegations. The suspension meant he had no police duties and was assigned closely supervised desk work with little to no public contact. It is noteworthy that Rudolph was one of 4 officers under investigation for manipulating speeding tickets issued by the Houston Police Department's Traffic Enforcement Unit. There were instances, for example, of tickets being issued at the same time in different locations hundreds of miles apart. There were also questionable tickets issued late at night. Police sources explained that the motive behind these irregularities was to commit fraud to earn overtime pay. Records show that Rudolph earned $158,000 in overtime since 2012. Although Rudolph was an absent figure, his death affected Rudy, who once again expressed his feelings on Facebook. He thanked those who sent condolences for his father, even though he had never known him. Rudy acknowledged feeling pain because his father's death permanently closed any possibility of a father-son relationship. He confessed that he never expected to feel anything for his father, but in the end, he experienced pain, sadness, lethargy, and other confusing emotions. Amid the emotional turmoil, on March 6, 2015, Rudy left his house around 6 p.m. to walk his 2 dogs in northwest Houston. A few hours later, one of the dogs returned home. The second dog came back the next morning, according to a police report. On March 7, 2015, Rudy's mother reported him missing. A missing persons flyer from that year noted that Rudy had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety, and that he might have stopped taking his prescribed medication. The flyer described Rudy as having suffered a leg injury that caused a slight limp. Rudy's cousin told the New York Post that although Rudy was 17, his mental age was around 10. Some of Rudy's family speculated that he might have been kidnapped and sold into a human trafficking ring. 2 years after his disappearance in May 2017, authorities put up a billboard in North Houston to draw attention from local residents in hopes that someone might provide clues to find him. On March 22, 2015, a GoFundMe campaign was launched to help Janie in her search for her son, Rudy. At the time, she claimed Rudy had physical and mental disabilities. The campaign raised $2,025. In 2017, Janie told a news channel that detectives had informed her Rudy might have been kidnapped and sold to human traffickers. However, the case grew more perplexing as sightings of Rudy were reported between 2018 and 2022. In 2018, another of Rudy's cousins called Houston police, saying she had seen Rudy at Janie's house. However, when officers arrived, they found no sign of him. She also mentioned that her grandmother often said she talked to Rudy, but as she was elderly, her claims were not taken seriously. The grandmother insisted that Rudy walked around the house. During a 2020 dispute over the grandmother's guardianship, Janie's sisters accused her of forcing their mother to live in a poorly maintained house. They wanted to move the elderly woman to another home because the current one was so run down that she slept on the couch as there was no bed. Additionally, the sisters alleged that the house was filled with animal urine and feces, causing the grandmother to suffer from skin infections. Despite Janie's denials, the grandmother continued to tell the family she saw and spoke to Rudy. Around the same time, neighbors began reporting seeing a young man resembling Rudy entering and leaving Janie's house. A detective from the Houston Police Department's Missing Persons Unit said that when Janie was questioned about the young man visiting her house, she claimed he was her nephew, not her son. On June 29, 2023, around 10 p.m., a person found Rudy severely injured outside a church in southeast Houston. The young man had bruises all over his body, especially on his face. On July 3, 2023, Janie issued a statement thanking the media and the public for their support over the years. She announced that her son Rudy had been found after being missing for 8 years. Janie mentioned that she had no additional information at that moment, but confirmed that Rudy was found unconscious and that the police and 911 were immediately notified. She assured everyone that Rudy was receiving the necessary care to overcome his trauma, but noted that he could not communicate verbally and requested privacy during this difficult time. Adding to the dramatic turn of events, Janie mentioned that Rudy was found clutching the chain his brother Charles used to wear around his neck. She later shared a photo of Rudy in a hospital bed. Rudy's aunts, however, disputed the authenticity of the photo, stating it was taken in 2012. On July 5, 2023, Rudy and his mother met with detectives from the Houston Police Department's Missing Persons Unit at a hotel. They were joined by Quanell X, a prominent activist and advisor for the local Black Panther movement. After the meeting, Quanell X told the media that Rudy had confided in him about experiencing oppressive practices and significant suffering over the past 8 years. He suggested that Janie should be investigated and possibly detained as Rudy, now 25, had endured uncomfortable situations implying a degree of intimacy, but did not label them as sexual in nature. Quanell X informed the press that Rudy had been found outside the church because he had taken his mother's car to escape, but ended up crashing it. He also mentioned that Rudy had been visiting neighbors under an alias. Following the press conference, Quanell X retracted his statements in an interview with The Independent, accusing the police of attempting a cover-up. He recommended providing Rudy with medical and psychological help. A video of Janie in front of her house surfaced on social media, where she expressed that she expected to be arrested. The video was recorded by local residents. On July 6, 2023, the police held their first press conference since Rudy was found. They confirmed that Rudy had returned home the day after being reported missing in 2015 and that his mother had misled the police by continuing to claim he was missing, asserting that the person seen by friends and family around the house was a nephew. The police explained that the district attorney had declined to press charges at that time since being missing is not a crime. That same day, Rudy's aunt reported that she had met with her nephew. She stated that Rudy was traumatized, did not want to be near his mother, and was staying with family friends. She called her sister Janie a pathological liar who had mistreated their mother, who had since passed away. She recalled how their late mother always insisted that Rudy was living in the house, only to be dismissed as lying by Janie. Learning that Rudy had been alive and controlled by his mother for 8 years, his cousin told a reporter that she felt more concern than relief. She found it disturbing that Janie had lied and hidden her adult son for 8 years for reasons that remained unclear. As more details of the case emerged, reporters found Janie's address and started arriving in her neighborhood. Janie became nervous and began offering money to residents, asking them to stay silent and not reveal that they had seen a young man entering and leaving the house when detectives and journalists arrived. Disturbed neighbors pointed out that the young man they now identify as Rudy had always been known to them as Dolph, Janie's nephew. Amid the media frenzy and the community's astonishment at the bizarre case, Janie's whereabouts remain unknown as she appears to have left her family home. A news media confirmed that activists and neighbors gathered on July 7th in front of Rudy's house in East Houston, demanding a thorough investigation by the district attorney and criminal charges against Rudy's mother. On July 13th, Rudy made his first public statements after spending 8 years hidden away due to his mother's actions, attracting worldwide attention. He explained how he stayed out of sight for so long out of obedience. Rudy agreed to the on-camera interview, but asked to have his face concealed because he felt overwhelmed by the attention his case had generated. He accused his mother, Janie, of brainwashing him, clarifying that he was never physically locked up or tied down. He could come and go as he pleased, but chose not to because she convinced him the world was a hostile place and they could only survive by staying together at home. The police added that although Rudy was listed as a missing person, he and his mother interacted with officers using false names and birthdays to hide their identities. During the interview, Rudy described feeling trapped in his own home for years, likening it to living in a prison. He recounted how Janie would lock him in a room whenever family members visited. He could hear them chatting and laughing but could not join in. Rudy shared that he eventually began to yearn for freedom, to have a job, live a life, love someone, and be loved. He fought to understand his emotions. Janie manipulated him into believing he had to stay silent for his own good, bombarding him with negative thoughts that made him complicit in the charade. It was a form of mental imprisonment, Rudy explained, as he could work with his mother as a security guard and roam the neighborhood, but always under her watchful eye. Following his reappearance and contact with people who clarified the situation, Rudy said his relationship with his mother felt like Stockholm Syndrome. This psychological coping mechanism involves victims developing positive feelings towards their captor to survive. Rudy expressed that his mother had psychologically imprisoned him and wielded significant power over him as his sole parental figure since childhood, alongside his late brother. Despite answering all the reporters' questions about his false disappearance, some of Rudy's explanations still leave gaps. For instance, when asked if he ever questioned Janie about why they kept pretending he was missing, he said he did not remember. Regarding the allegations by activist Quinnell X about inappropriate advances by his mother, Rudy stated that the media had twisted his words. He mentioned occasionally sleeping with his mother but did not recall why, asserting it was not intimate, though he felt uncomfortable with it. Reporters also asked if his mother had ever drugged him. Rudy recalled an incident when he was about 12 years old and she gave him a bottle of Tylenol PM or sleeping pills. According to Rudy, his mother forced him to go to the hospital, making him pretend he was sick from an overdose. He couldn't remember why she did this, but suggested it might have been because she had something to do at school. He added that around the time of his supposed disappearance, He didn't know how to handle his emotions, especially since it happened right after his brother, Charles, passed away. When asked if his mother wanted him to take on a husband-like role at home, he said yes, but only in terms of shared responsibilities, like cooking and cleaning, with nothing romantic or intimate involved. Rudy told the reporters that he finally decided to leave home because he wanted to end the life he was living, where his mother kept him hidden, manipulated him, and made him believe the outside world was dangerous. When asked what message he would send to his mother if she saw the interview, Rudy replied that he wanted her to leave him alone and let him live his life and be happy. Throughout the interview, Rudy's tone was marked by anxiety and distress. In response to Rudy's shocking and unexpected revelations, his Aunt Pauline spoke to the media, expressing her deep concern for her nephew and noting that Rudy was still scared. Janie's whereabouts remain unknown, but it's possible she will face legal action from GoFundMe for benefiting from the false disappearance story. The fundraising platform stated that she had been permanently banned from GoFundMe and future beneficiary opportunities after the scam came to light. GoFundMe has a zero-tolerance policy for misuse of the platform and cooperates with police investigations into alleged misconduct. The GoFundMe campaign claimed Janie was a single mother who lost her eldest son in 2011 and Rudy's father in 2014. She needed financial help as she couldn't work due to dedicating herself to searching for her missing son. Consequently, bills were piling up, and her health had deteriorated mentally, physically, and emotionally. Brenda Paradise, a private investigator who worked on the case, believes resources were misused in the search for Rudy. Brenda is part of the non-profit organization We Help the Missing. She mentioned that volunteers searched wooded areas and made exhaustive efforts to find Rudy. She shared some of her audio notes from 2015, where Janie accused a gang of Mexicans of kidnapping her son, but this alleged group never contacted her. Brenda has not ruled out filing a lawsuit for the expenses incurred by the association during Rudy's 8-year disappearance. Rudy's case highlights the vulnerability of minors under negligent or abusive parents. In 2018, approximately 9.2 out of every 1,000 children in the United States were subjected to some form of maltreatment, according to the Children's Bureau. Neglect is the most common form of maltreatment, present in 60% of cases, as reported by the same bureau. Neglect occurs when a parent or guardian fails to meet a child's basic needs, whether medical, educational, physical, or emotional. The combination of oppression and deprivation of liberty seen in Rudy's case is common in situations involving Stockholm Syndrome within controlling relationships. One way these feelings and thoughts develop is through cognitive dissonance, which explains how and why people change their ideas and opinions to endure situations that don't seem healthy, positive, or normal. The year was 1988. 16-year-old Dwayne lived a blissful life with his family in the serene town of Alturas, Florida. His mother, Peggy, worked tirelessly as a waitress at the local diner. After raising 3 children on her own, Peggy finally found love with Kyle Carr, who brought 2 more children into their blended family. Their life in Alturas seemed perfect. A quiet town where no one locked their doors, an ideal place to raise a family. But on October 23rd, their lives took a tragic turn. In the early hours, Peggy left for work as usual. However, soon after arriving at the diner, she began to feel a burning sensation in her legs and feet, followed by intense chest pain. she was rushed to the hospital, almost incapacitated. Despite thorough testing, doctors couldn't pinpoint the cause of her illness and sent her home with pain medication. A week later, on October 30th, the nightmare escalated. Peggy, Dwayne, and his stepbrother Travis were all rushed to the hospital with identical symptoms. The pain was unbearable, leaving them in tears thinking they were going to die. Peggy was admitted to the intensive care unit. An infectious disease specialist noticed something alarming. Peggy's hair was falling out in clumps, a sign that pointed to possible poisoning. He decided to test for thallium, a deadly poison banned in the US in 1972, but still present in old rat poison. The test results were horrifying. Peggy had 50 times the lethal amount of thallium in her system. The next day, October 31st, she fell into a coma. Travis was put on a respirator and Dwayne showed no signs of improvement. The police launched an urgent investigation. Their goal was clear: find the source of the poisoning to prevent further harm. They scoured the orange groves, tested the neighborhood water supply, and even examined the diner where Peggy worked. Yet, no traces of thallium were found. As news spread, panic gripped the community. People demanded answers, fearing for their own safety. Investigators descended upon the Carr home, meticulously collecting dust samples and gathering over 400 household items for lab analysis. One of these items raised alarm bells: a six-pack of Coke bottles, 3 of which remained unopened. Tests revealed that each contained more than a gram of thallium, enough to kill an adult. The detective in charge quickly realized there were only 2 possible scenarios. The first involved product tampering at the Coke factory. If that were the case, how many more people might have consumed the poison? The potential spread could reach far beyond the county, possibly affecting the entire state or even the nation. Fear spread rapidly, with locals terrified to drink Coke. The investigation's initial focus was on the bottling company. However, with Coca-Cola's cooperation, large-scale tampering was swiftly ruled out. It was deemed physically impossible to tamper with the product at the plant. This left the police with only one conclusion. This was a targeted attack on Peggy Carr and her family. The investigation turned inward, examining family members closely. Peggy's husband, Perielin Carr, emerged as a primary suspect. Despite being married for only 7 months, the couple's honeymoon period had been short-lived. Perielin worked long hours at the mine, and Peggy had grown suspicious. One night, she discovered him with another woman. Adding to the suspicion, the weekend Peggy first fell ill, Perielin was conveniently out of town. Upon his return, he resisted taking her to the hospital. As investigators delved deeper into Perielin's background, they sought any motive that might explain why he would poison his wife. Despite his troubling behavior, one question nagged at the police: why would Perielin poison his own son, Travis? During interrogation, Perielin revealed a puzzling clue. On June 14th, 4 months before Peggy fell ill, Dwayne found a letter in the mailbox. The letter contained a yellow post-it with a threatening typewritten note, warning the family to leave Florida within 2 weeks or face death. Dwayne and his siblings initially laughed it off, but Perielin's dismissive attitude now seemed more suspicious. The police later learned that this was not the first ominous incident in the Carr household. A few years prior, 2 of their dogs had died suddenly, both exhibiting symptoms of severe illness and hair loss. This led to a chilling suspicion. They might have been used for experimentation. As Peggy's health continued to deteriorate and Dwayne and Travis showed no signs of improvement, the entire family underwent testing for thallium. The results were far more alarming than anyone anticipated. Every member of the household, including Peggy Carr, had traces of thallium in their system. This revelation cleared Peggy as a suspect, as it seemed implausible that someone with the knowledge to commit such a crime would risk ingesting the poison themselves. Even Peggy's 2-year-old granddaughter, Casey, had traces of thallium. On March 3, 1989, after 5 months of suffering, Peggy's condition reached its tragic conclusion. Dwayne was called to her bedside for the final time as the family faced the heartbreaking decision to remove her from life support. Peggy Carr passed away at the age of 41, leaving the family devastated. With Peggy's death, the investigation took a new turn. It was now a murder case. Poisoning someone is a rare and calculated method of murder, often devised by a demented yet brilliant mind. The FBI's examination of the contaminated Coke bottles revealed tiny scratch marks, indicating they had been meticulously tampered with. The thallium had been added, the caps resealed, and the bottles appeared untouched. Thallium, being tasteless and odorless, dissolves easily but usually causes noticeable changes in soda. However, the mixture found in the Coke bottles was sophisticated, avoiding typical signs like overflow, discoloration, or sediment. This pointed to the work of someone with advanced knowledge of chemistry, a highly intelligent individual who believed they were smarter than everyone else. Police began questioning neighbors and townspeople. Alturas, a small community of a few hundred residents, saw every single person interviewed as investigators sought to uncover the perpetrator behind this heinous act. The closest neighbors to the Carr family were George Trepal and his wife, Diana. When the detectives questioned Trepal, his reaction was shockingly harsh. Trepal launched into a tirade about the redneck children and family living next to him. When asked why anyone would want to poison the Carr family, Trepal's response was unsettlingly specific. Someone wanted them to leave. This echoed the exact message in the threatening letter received by the Carrs, a detail only known to law enforcement. This peculiar response made Trepal a prime suspect. Further investigation revealed that George Trepal was a self-taught chemist, while his wife, Diana, held a master's degree in chemistry. Both were members of an elite society for individuals with IQs in the top 2% of the population. Digging deeper, investigators discovered Trepal had a criminal background. He had served time in prison for being the chemist in a major methamphetamine operation. One of the ingredients commonly used in producing methamphetamine is thallium. The spotlight on George Trepal as a person of interest shocked even Peggy's son, Dwayne, who couldn't believe Trepal was capable of such a heinous act. The detectives uncovered that Trepal had previously had a confrontation with the Carr family over loud music. Just 48 hours after this argument, Peggy Carr was poisoned. Despite these connections, the police lacked concrete proof to arrest Trepal. Standard police procedure often involves bringing a suspect in for questioning, hoping for a confession. However, detectives believed this approach wouldn't work with Trepal, an introverted and non-confrontational individual. Instead, the FBI proposed a different strategy. Someone had to go undercover to outsmart Trepal. The police assigned Special Agent Susan Gorick to infiltrate the group to which George Trepal belonged. The aim was to gain Trepal's trust and gather enough evidence to prove his involvement in the poisoning. Initially, it seemed that Detective Susan Gorick would only need to go undercover for a weekend. However, she was warned about Trepal's photographic memory. If he saw them, he could remember their cars or faces. Under an assumed identity, Susan prepared to attend a murder mystery, gathering hosted by George Trepal and his wife, Diana. Susan Gorick transformed into a woman on the verge of divorcing an abusive husband. On April 14, 1989, she headed to the local hotel where the event was being held. Upon arrival, she was greeted by none other than George Trepal himself. Face to face with the suspected killer, Susan's biggest fear was that Trepal might recognize her from previous surveillance operations. She took a deep breath, searching for any sign of recognition in his eyes, but Trepal didn't seem to recognize her. Nevertheless, Susan had to remain vigilant. In her undercover role, Susan knew Trepal was not the type to confront directly. He was the kind who would poison his victims, causing a slow and painful death. The risk was immense. Introducing herself as Sherry Gwynn, she registered for the event and received a packet containing the weekend's information, prepared by Trepal himself. The pamphlet detailed several well-planned murder scenarios, one of which involved poisoning. One paragraph in particular stood out. It mentioned that when a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. The message was strikingly similar to the one the Carr family had received before Peggy was poisoned. This eerie similarity convinced Susan she had the right suspect. Throughout the weekend, Susan engaged Trepal in conversation, carefully watching every word he said, knowing one slip could cost her life. When Trepal asked about her background, Susan mentioned her fictional husband, a lawyer from Houston, Texas, and how she had left him. Trepal shared how he could tell when someone was lying by the way their neck muscles moved, making Susan even more nervous. Before the weekend ended, she confided in Trepal that she intended to move to Florida to escape her husband. This revelation led to a crucial breakthrough. Trepal mentioned that he and his wife were considering moving her practice and selling their house. After consulting with her supervisors, Detective Susan was instructed to continue her undercover operation beyond the initial weekend. Susan knew this extended mission was her chance to find crucial evidence that could secure a search warrant for Trepal's house. She hoped to discover lab equipment or chemicals that would link Trepal to the crime. The following week, Susan visited Trepal's house. During the tour, Trepal mentioned how safe Alturas was, boasting that no one locked their doors. Although Susan noticed several suspicious items, including a secret passageway in the library and a mannequin with bondage gear, none were sufficient for a search warrant. Despite the failed plan, Susan maintained her Sherry Gwynn persona, determined to gather more evidence. She was acutely aware of the risks. Exposing her true identity could lead to her and her family's harm. Trepal, a highly intelligent individual, could easily resort to poisoning her if he discovered she was an undercover detective. Over the next several months, Susan met with Trepal for a series of lunch dates, always under surveillance. She never ate or drank anything after leaving the table, wary of Trepal's potential to harm her. During these meetings, Trepal gradually revealed his disdain for people he considered less intelligent, giving Susan insights into his mindset. After 8 months, Susan had collected numerous small pieces of evidence, but not enough to build a solid case. Her supervisors began to question the operation's value, threatening to shut it down. To Susan, failure was not an option. She was driven by the need to secure justice for Peggy Carr and her family, imagining how it could have been her own loved ones who drank the poison. In December 1989, Susan received the breakthrough call she had been waiting for. George and Diana Trepal had moved out of town and offered Sherry Gwynn the chance to move into their home. Without needing a warrant, Susan now had legal permission to enter the house and invite the county crime scene unit to investigate. Believing Trapal was too clever to leave obvious traces of thallium, the team focused on finding residue in places like the air conditioning filter or drains. The house was still filled with Trapal's belongings, providing ample opportunities for collecting samples. In the garage of George Trapal's house, investigators collected vials and chemistry bottles, hoping one would test positive for thallium. As they awaited results from the FBI lab, Susan continued her role as Sherry Gwynn, even as ideas and scenarios to engage Trapal ran thin. Time was running out. By January 1990, with no news from the lab, Susan knew she had to take action. She decided to try and trick Trapal into incriminating himself, unaware that Trapal was also preparing a trap for her. Susan arranged a meeting with Trapal at a picnic area behind a McDonald's in Sebring, the town where he was living. This critical meeting was recorded on tape. During their conversation, Susan handed Trapal a business card claiming it was left by detectives searching for him. Trapal's behavior changed noticeably. He became extremely nervous. His agitation was palpable as he tried to maintain composure. He repeatedly asked Susan to come over to his new house, which she declined. The tension was high. What might have happened if she had agreed to visit his home? After the meeting, Trapal walked away visibly shaken, his nerves clearly frayed by the news Susan had shared. This encounter marked a turning point. On April 4th, 1990, Susan received an unexpected call. The FBI had found thallium in one of the vials collected from Trapal's garage. Specifically, it contained thallium nitrate, the exact compound used in the poisoning of Peggy Carr and the attempted murder of her entire family. This discovery was the crucial piece of evidence needed to solidify the case against Trapal. The following day, April 5th, George Trapal was arrested at his new home in Sebring. The sight of Trapal being escorted in an orange jumpsuit into the county jail marked the end of a long and dangerous investigation. The same man Susan had to trust during her undercover mission was now facing justice for his crimes. Even when confronted with the truth about her identity, George Trapal remained unfazed. Susan, now revealing herself as S Special Agent from the county sheriff's office, served him with a warrant for handwriting samples. Trapal simply smiled and responded, "Oh, okay." Unbeknownst to Susan, she had narrowly escaped becoming Trapal's next victim. When police searched Trapal's home in Sebring, they made a shocking discovery. Behind a pegboard, they found a hidden room with no inside door handle and a sealed, soundproof window. Inside, there was a platform bed equipped with wooden stirrups and a pulley system designed to lift people. Trapal had been constructing a bed for torture. The realization of what could have happened if she had visited his home was horrifying for Susan. In January 1991, as George Trapal's trial began, the jury was presented with overwhelming evidence. Among the items collected from Trapal's house was a journal titled General Poisoning Guides, which described thallium as the poison of choice for criminals. The journal contained references to getting rid of neighbors, and 55 fingerprints in the journal matched Trapal's. The prosecution also showcased the tools used to tamper with the Coke bottles. A set of tiny screwdrivers, one of which was missing, perfectly matched the tool marks on the bottle caps. This damning evidence shocked the jury. Throughout the trial, Trapal remained calm and emotionless, sometimes even smiling. His lack of remorse and his calculated actions demonstrated a chilling level of evil. He had justified his heinous acts with his belief in his superior intelligence and the idea that those less intelligent did not deserve to live. The trial lasted 2 months, but it only took the jury 4 hours to reach a verdict. On March 6, 1991, nearly 2 years after Peggy Carr's death, George Trepal was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death. The final sentence was delivered with gravitas. The defendant, George James Trepal, shall be electrocuted until he is dead. With these words, justice was served for Peggy Carr. Special Agent Susan's relentless dedication and bravery brought a criminal mastermind to justice. She risked everything, putting her life on the line to ensure Trepal faced the consequences of his heinous actions. Reflecting on Susan's efforts, one cannot help but admire her courage. She went above and beyond to bring Peggy's killer to justice, earning the respect and gratitude of many. The rest of Peggy Carr's family, who were also poisoned, made full recoveries. However, the loss of Peggy had a profound impact on her son, Dwayne. Losing his mother at the tender age of 16 was a traumatic experience that left deep emotional scars. In the years following her death, Dwayne struggled with grief, often expressing it through anger and outbursts. Eventually, Dwayne found solace in writing to his mother. In a heartfelt letter, he poured out his emotions. "Dear Mom, this is your baby boy. I'd like to tell you that I love you and I'm sorry for all the bad things I've ever done to you. Hopefully, you're in a better place now. I often think about you and wish you were here. I haven't been so good and I'm sorry. I'll try to get my life straight." Dwayne made good on his promise. Today, he is married and has become the father figure his own family deserves. Every day, he strives to make his mother proud and keep her memory alive. Dwayne Dauberly stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, showing that even after unimaginable tragedy, a life worth living is possible. In early April 2011, for the first time in years, the shutters of house number 55 on Boulevard Robert Schumann remained closed. This house, located in a residential neighborhood of Nantes, France, belonged to the Dupont de Ligonnes family. The family comprised Xavier, Agnes, and their 4 teenage children. The unusual silence around the usually lively home caught the neighbors' attention. Typically filled with the sounds of the children and their 2 dogs, the sudden quiet was alarming. Known for keeping their shutters open even when on vacation, the closed shutters prompted the neighbors to alert the local police, fearing something might have happened. During an initial inspection, the officers found no trace of the family. However, it was on the 5th inspection that they made a horrific discovery. Located in the western suburbs of Paris, Versailles is the birthplace of Xavier Dupont de Ligonnes, born on March 9, 1961. He was the eldest son of the French Count Bernard Hubert Dupont de Ligonnes and his wife Geneviève Thérèse Maître. In 1966, the family welcomed a daughter named Christine. When Bernard left his wife for a lover, Xavier assumed a leadership role within his family, taking care of his mother and sister Christine. Geneviève claimed to receive divine messages, which she recorded during automatic writing sessions, similar to a surrealist poet. Her peculiar beliefs evolved into sermons about an impending apocalypse, leading her to establish a cult named the Church of Philadelphia. The group included members of the aristocracy, whom Geneviève convinced were chosen to survive the apocalypse and partake in the world's renewal. Christine was designated by her mother to bear the Savior. According to Geneviève, the child would be a reincarnation of both Jesus and Satan, destined to bring salvation. Despite inheriting his father's noble title, Xavier showed little interest in French traditions, instead being fascinated by luxury, high-end cars, and eccentricities. He also admired the United States greatly. Geneviève funded Xavier's lavish lifestyle through significant contributions from cult members who were sworn to secrecy about their activities. In 1974, on the paradisiacal island of Bréa, Xavier met Emmanuel Teneur. The two boys formed a deep bond of mutual understanding, which lasted throughout their lives. It is said that Emmanuel even confessed his love for Xavier at that time, but despite the rejection, their close friendship remained intact. 2 years later, Xavier met Agnès Hodange. The girl was born on November 9, 1962, in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just outside Paris. She stood out for her deep religious devotion. She worked as an assistant at the Blanche de Castille Catholic School in Nantes, where her responsibilities included teaching catechism. Although little is known about her family background, it is well documented that Xavier and Agnès developed a close relationship, leading to a passionate but brief romance before they went their separate ways. In 1990, Agnès gave birth to her first child, Arthur, from a casual relationship. Soon after, she and Xavier reunited, rekindled their love, and decided to marry. Xavier adopted Arthur as his own son. 2 years later, they welcomed their first son together, Thomas, the heir to the family name. To commemorate the occasion, Xavier chose Emmanuel as Thomas's godfather. Following Thomas, the couple had 2 more children, Anne and Benoit. The family of 6 seemed to embody the ideal family, with Xavier appearing as a loving father and the children excelling academically, suggesting a promising future. Agnès was dedicated to instilling her faith in her children, frequently taking them to Mass. Other parishioners saw her as kind but firm with her children. Around the year 2000, in line with their interests and preferences, Xavier moved his family to the United States. Xavier, a discreet, charismatic, and multilingual man, believed he could blend in seamlessly in the United States. However, this venture failed, leading to significant financial losses. Upon returning to France, he began accumulating substantial debts related to his professional activities, which were always somewhat ambiguous. Various investigations have described him as a salesman. According to French media reports, money troubles had been a significant concern for Xavier for several years. One of his failed ventures included an unusual scheme to import cars from the United States to France. He also started several small businesses, all of which saw limited success. These included a hotel and restaurant guide for sales representatives, a customer loyalty system for restaurants, an association called the French Federation of Commerce, and a discreet business where he was listed as the manager. The accounts for this last enterprise were minimal, and in 2003, he hired 6 salespeople. Xavier's work often took him away from home from Monday to Friday and brought in a meager income, around $4,200 annually in declared earnings. Gradually, financial issues began to strain his marriage, likely exacerbated by typical marital disagreements. In 2004, Agnès wrote extensively on a French forum, detailing the challenges she and her husband faced. Notably, she mentioned that he had once told her that a group death as a family wouldn't be catastrophic. By 2009, the increasing debts severely impacted their relationship, leading to a temporary separation. During this period, Xavier sent numerous letters blaming Agnès for the family's troubles and holding her responsible for their financial ruin. This emotional turmoil took a toll on Agnès, causing her to lose her appetite and struggle with insomnia. On numerous occasions, Xavier turned to his friend Emmanuel for assistance. Emmanuel, hailing from a wealthy family, had inherited a substantial fortune from his father. Despite his wealth, Emmanuel lived modestly in a small apartment. An enigmatic and somewhat eccentric individual, he never hesitated to lend Xavier significant sums of money. In addition to financial support, Emmanuel funded Xavier's travels and even co-signed for the house where Xavier eventually settled with his family in the late 2000s. Thanks to Emmanuel's generosity, the family resided in a chalet located in the suburbs at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann, west of Nantes. Once settled, the neighbors quickly formed the impression that Agnes was bossy and less pleasant than her husband. Behind closed doors, Agnes faced a personal hell. She viewed Xavier as both too fragile and paradoxically too rigid, almost militaristic. An old-fashioned man, he played the head of the household but was emotionally distant, lacking tenderness and affection, and sometimes even abusive. Furthermore, Agnes confided in her friends from the Thursday prayer group about her fears of how Genevieve controlled Xavier. She described her mother-in-law as a mentally ill mystic and was deeply afraid. On January 20th, 2011, Bernard passed away. Given the disparity between his lifestyle and financial difficulties, Xavier hoped his father's death would result in an inheritance. However, he was in for a shock. Upon delving into his father's estate, he found nothing substantial. All that remained were a few papers, a rifle, a card, a ring, and some cash, which Xavier promptly took. Within hours of Bernard's death, Xavier withdrew cash using his father's card. On February 2nd, he acquired a firearms license, and by March 12th, he had purchased a silencer for the rifle. During this period, he also bought quicklime. He practiced shooting the rifle in his garden, aiming at a balloon on a stand. Emmanuel, who was visiting, tried the rifle and saw nothing suspicious. Xavier explained that the silencer was to avoid disturbing the neighbors. On Friday, April 1st, the two friends went to a shooting range together, where Bernard's inherited rifle was a focal point of interest. The following day, Emmanuel called Xavier 5 times and they spoke for nearly an hour. Investigation suggests that the horror began on Sunday, April 3rd. That night, Xavier, Agnes, and their children went to the movies and later enjoyed a pleasant evening dining at a restaurant. Everyone was present except for Thomas, who was studying at a Catholic university and lived in a nearby student hostel. After their night out, the family returned to their chalet, where neighbors saw them and some family members even exchanged text messages with friends and acquaintances. Xavier messaged Christine, telling her about their dinner outing. The most accepted theory is that Xavier drugged his wife and children, waited until they were asleep, then shot them and buried them in the garden. He also did the same to the family's 2 Labrador dogs. Xavier's alibi was as macabre as his actions. On Monday morning, he began contacting people related to his family circle from as early as 6 a.m. He called Agnes's workplace to say she was sick and contacted the children's schools, claiming Arthur, Agnes's son from a previous relationship, had a motorcycle accident and that Anne and Benoit were ill. By midday, he sent a letter to the restaurant where Arthur worked, saying Arthur was resigning because his father had been transferred to Australia. He still had Thomas to deal with. On that same Monday, April 4th, Xavier contacted Thomas and had dinner with him at a restaurant near his university residence. After the meal, a tired Thomas returned to his room. The following day, Thomas received an urgent message from his father, claiming that Agnes had a bicycle accident and was in a mild coma at a hospital, prompting Thomas to travel immediately to Nantes. It is presumed that Xavier killed Thomas in the same manner as his siblings and mother. Later that evening, Emmanuel spoke with Xavier again, and this time they talked for just under 19 minutes. At midnight, a friend of Thomas received a message from him, stating he was home watching a movie with his father. Thomas was likely already dead by then. About an hour later, Xavier sent an email to Emmanuel, arranging to meet soon. Emmanuel replied, reminding Xavier that he had power of attorney and that the key was on the sailboat. Contrary to what one might expect, Xavier did not act discreetly. He went in and out of his house, even leaving a note on the door asking not to deliver any more mail. Instead of hiding, he withdrew cash from ATMs and his image was captured by security cameras. He paid with his credit cards at restaurants and stayed in hotels under his real name. As Xavier's perfect escape began, neighbors gradually noticed troubling signs. The once open windows of the chalet had been closed for days. The local children no longer saw the family's 4 children. The dogs barking had ceased, and Agnes hadn't returned to work. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Piecing together the clues, the concerned neighbors contacted the authorities. Upon arrival, officers found a nearly empty refrigerator with only a few jars of preserves. They discovered a still damp mop in the kitchen, a chess set on the living room table, and guitars on a sofa. It seemed the Dupont de Ligonnes family had vanished. The scene was eerie. Beds were stripped of sheets, picture frames were empty, and closets had missing clothes. In the midst of the mystery, on April 9th, a letter surfaced, sent to family and friends. It claimed that Xavier had been hired by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and that the family had to leave undercover as part of a witness protection program, explaining their sudden disappearance and lack of communication. Suspicion and worry grew among neighbors who felt there was something off about this story. Fearing for the family's lives, they urged authorities to investigate further. Meanwhile, Xavier embarked on a journey through southern France in his car. As the case gained media attention, more details from the past emerged. On April 15th, security cameras captured Xavier entering a small hotel near Cannes. He parked his car, took a bag, and disappeared into the nearby woods. This was the last confirmed sighting of him. Curiously, on that same day, Emmanuel called his mother, revealing long-held secrets. He was homosexual, alcoholic, and depressed. Responding to the neighbors' pleas and lack of leads, authorities revisited the family home. On April 21st, 2011, a freshly disturbed patch of earth under a terrace caught an officer's attention. They soon uncovered a concrete slab and moments later made a grim discovery. The bodies of Agnes and her 4 children were found, wrapped in bags, each with 2 to 3 gunshot wounds and covered in religious symbols. They had been meticulously buried in burlap sacks with quicklime. The family's 2 Labradors were also found buried. Despite the thorough search, no traces of blood, fingerprints, or DNA were found. Xavier became the most wanted man in France, accused of the massacre. His face dominated the news, earning him titles such as the Most Wanted Man, the Nantes Killer, and the Face of Horror. Yet, it seemed he had mysteriously vanished from the face of the earth. The autopsy results of the 5 bodies revealed to authorities that they were dealing with a meticulously planned execution. Most of the bullets had been fired into the victims' heads. Additionally, traces of a sedative were found in the children, confirming the hypothesis that they were attacked while sleeping. A startling detail emerged regarding Agnes. In the master bedroom, investigators found a device she used to manage her sleep apnea, which had stopped functioning at precisely 3:27 a.m. on April 4th. Investigators speculated that Xavier might have hesitated to kill Thomas, as he was the heir to the family name. Due to the close bond between Xavier and Emmanuel, the latter was summoned by the authorities. Emmanuel appeared cooperative during these initial inquiries, expressing his belief that Xavier's disappearance was a sort of pilgrimage before committing suicide. When questioned about the rifle, Emmanuel initially denied knowledge of it. However, deeper investigation into his life revealed inconsistencies, and authorities soon realized that he was not entirely who he claimed to be. A significant development occurred 24 hours later. Just before noon, Nantes police searched Emmanuel's apartment. They confiscated his laptop, and Emmanuel then disclosed what he truly knew about Xavier's rifle. A subsequent examination of the hard drive uncovered extensive correspondence between Emmanuel and Xavier. These exchanges range from mundane to philosophical, with some emails adding a peculiar tone to their relationship. One email, sent in the early hours of April 6th, particularly caught the police's attention. These accumulated details led investigators to suspect that Emmanuel might have assisted in Xavier's escape. But Emmanuel was not the only suspect. Christine also drew the investigators' scrutiny. During their interviews, Christine and Geneviève were evasive, painting a superficial picture of Xavier and denying any knowledge of the Church of Philadelphia. Geneviève spoke about Xavier's childhood, but avoided uncomfortable topics such as the source of their income, and she outright denied the existence of the sect. However, the diligence of the investigative team paid off. They discovered a copy of a complaint filed years earlier by former sect members who had fled in fear after Christine proposed to have sex with all the men to conceive the chosen one. This revelation about the sect, which included wealthy members providing financial support, was crucial. Investigators believe this environment might have offered Xavier logistical and material assistance. As a result, all former members of the Church of Philadelphia were interrogated, and the police monitored the sect's followers, hoping to catch any slip-ups in conversation or email. Despite these efforts, no definitive leads emerged. Meanwhile, Xavier's cell phone records allowed authorities to trace his movements within the country. The last concrete trace of Xavier was a security recording from April 15th. Investigators speculated that he was carrying the weapon in his bag based on its shape. While everything suggested he might have committed suicide in the woods, the detectives were puzzled as exhaustive searches in the dense forest yielded no body or remains. This led to the theory that Xavier might have been picked up by a boat and taken to another country. Consequently, an international arrest warrant was issued. On May 4th, Nantes police contacted the National Center for Fisheries Monitoring to verify if Emmanuel or Xavier owned a motorboat or sailboat. They found nothing, although they knew the records might not be fully up to date. On May 9th, Emmanuel was summoned to the Nantes police station for another interview, which was, in fact, an interrogation. The police were now focused on finding a boat and identifying its captain. At this point, Emmanuel was unaware of the depth of the investigation or the suspicion surrounding him. When questioned about a reference to a sailboat, Emmanuel explained it as a coincidence. He revealed that he had given Xavier power of attorney to access his safe deposit box. Should anything happen to Emmanuel, the key was stored on a model sailboat in an apartment. The safe contained his will, and that was all. The police let Emmanuel go, feeling frustrated and empty-handed. Despite the coincidences, the investigation remained uncertain. At this stage, Emmanuel was seen merely as a witness. No arrests had been made, and the police debated the point of further interrogating him, though they decided to apply some pressure as he remained the most credible accomplice. A significant detail emerged when investigators reviewed all checks issued to Xavier's company. They found an unusual check for $4,200 signed by Emmanuel. The address on the check indicated a previously unknown account in Monaco. An immediate request for the account statements was sent, but Monaco's strict banking privacy laws meant the authorities there would only respond to their own regulatory agencies. On September 28th, 4 police officers visited Emmanuel's residence again. After long minutes, Emmanuel emerged, disoriented and in his underwear, barely able to confirm his identity. The sparse interior of his apartment was littered with empty alcohol bottles, reflecting a state of deep loneliness. Emmanuel had not received any letters or phone calls from his friend, and that was what tormented him. The police no longer saw him as a suspect, but as a castaway, leading them to question if they were following the wrong lead. Xavier had become one of France's most wanted alleged murderers, possibly even globally. In 2015, a journalist claimed to have received a letter from Xavier stating he was alive. Handwriting, DNA, and fingerprint analyses were conducted, but the note did not yield any new information. On January 9, 2018, police raided a monastery in Roquebrune-sur-Argent after a tip-off about a monk resembling Xavier. After 2 hours of intense searching, they determined it was a case of mistaken identity. On January 18, 2019, Emmanuel died of a heart attack. That same year, authorities arrested a man they believed to be Xavier at Glasgow Airport in Scotland. Once again, it was a case of mistaken identity. Another theory suggested Xavier might be in South America, specifically Argentina, where his language skills and charisma could help him blend in. Years have passed, and the Church of Philadelphia has not only persisted, but has reportedly experienced a resurgence. This small, highly secretive group includes members who have been part of it for nearly 40 years, living as if withdrawn from the world. In the summer of 2019, 2 brothers raised within the sect filed new complaints against Christine and Genevieve. For 2 decades, these women have fervently preached that Xavier is alive, innocent, and hiding in the United States as part of a witness protection program. They claim everything written in the April 9th letter is pure fabrication. This might sound like denial, but it could also be a way to obscure certain truths. Since 2011, the case has been mired in speculation and false leads, sending authorities down endless labyrinths. The pressing question remains: will justice ever be served for Agnes and her children? Despite the bleak outlook, some believe that the truth will eventually come to light. Don't be fooled by images of this young man with a visibly beaten face. The reality is, he has caused a real tragedy. James Lloyd Allen was born in Providence, Rhode Island, USA, on August 29, 1954. He was one of 3 children born to Lloyd James Allen and Jacqueline Allen, with siblings named Danny and John. The Allens were a typical middle-class family, closely knit and active members of St. Thomas Church. The only out-of-the-ordinary aspect was Lloyd's job. He was a police captain in Providence. As a child, Allen admired his father and the idea of doing things right, though he still found time for some mischief during his school years. Alan is remembered by his family and friends for secretly listening to his favorite baseball team, the Boston Red Sox, on a radio earpiece during class, hoping the nuns wouldn't notice. Growing up with strong values of service, he eventually followed in his father's professional footsteps. His faith also remained a crucial part of his life. By the late 1970s, during weekly prayer meetings at St. Thomas Church, Alan's attention was drawn to a woman named Marge, who was from Bristol and 4 years his senior. Despite the daily demands of his police work, Alan was too shy to approach her. However, fate intervened when Marge was robbed and contacted the police. It turned out her home was in the area Alan patrolled. When responding to the call and finally meeting her, he found himself in a comfortable role. After taking her statement, he made several follow-up visits which led to dating. They married in 1988 at St. Thomas Church. She was 38 and he was 34. Alan and Marge had different personalities, but they shared the same core values and a deep love for each other. This love was the foundation of their wonderful family. They had 2 daughters, Jennifer and Caitlin. Alan wasn't the handiest person around the house, but he was a dedicated dad who adored his daughters more than anything. To support his family, he also worked a second job as a security guard at a supermarket on the east side of the city, which allowed Marge to stay home and take care of their daughters. Their marriage was mostly peaceful. They enjoyed staying in to watch TV or play with their daughters rather than going out. The only real disagreement at home was about baseball, since Marge was a big Yankees fan and she passed that passion on to her daughters. So, whenever they watched games together, there was a bit of a friendly rivalry. As the girls grew up, Marge started working at St. Thomas School. James, on the other hand, was all in on his job in public service, truly embodying what it meant to be an excellent police officer. His co-workers and friends saw him as a man of integrity, with a lot of compassion for crime victims and a knack for solving crimes. His amazing memory and observational skills, along with his resilience and courage, were what made him stand out. He always went the extra mile and was ready to answer calls even in the middle of the night. By 2005, he had become one of the most seasoned detectives in the department, honored with numerous medals, including the Departmental Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart. Known for his signature trench coat, rain or shine, James brought laughter and comfort to Marge and their friends. Meanwhile, Esteban Carpio lived nearby and seemed to be on the wrong side of the law. Born in Boston, Massachusetts on July 30th, 1978, to an unknown father, Esteban was raised by his mother, a third-grade teacher. There isn't much known about his early years. As an adult, he worked as a barber and had a history of legal troubles related to substance possession. In the early 2000s, he started a relationship with Samaine Finn. They later had a daughter together. Esteban's behavior started to change for the worse in late 2004. He began acting oddly, claiming to hear voices and believing that a friend had cursed him or used voodoo on him. Whether true or not, his girlfriend took him to a Buddhist temple for help, where a monk tried to protect him by tying a rope around his waist. But it didn't help, and his condition didn't improve, so his mother called for a psychiatric evaluation. The doctors linked his issues to stress and substance abuse, but it's unclear if any steps were taken to address his substance use. The following year, with no improvement in his condition, his mother, Yvonne Carpio, took him back to the hospital. That spring, Esteban crossed paths with Madeline Gata, an 84-year-old active woman who loved her craft of sewing. She had worked as an interior decorator and had created custom designs for various clients. She was also a proud grandmother to 6 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. On April 16, 2005, after finishing work early in the afternoon, Detective James grabbed a quick bite at a favorite spot before heading home. Meanwhile, Esteban, who was driving nearby, spotted Madeline. Seeing her as an easy target, he quickly got out of his car with a knife. He tried to steal her purse but ended up hurting her with the knife. Her screams alerted people nearby, and one quick-thinking neighbor noted Esteban's car license plate as he ran away. Madeline was taken to a health center where she managed to report what happened. Around 7 in the evening, James's phone rang at home, and he promptly answered. The call was about the attack on the elderly woman and the suspect's clear description, prompting the detective to spring into action. The police team, including James, arrived at Esteban's residence the next day. According to statements from Esteban's family, they warned the officers that Esteban was experiencing a mental crisis, having trouble sleeping, and was not in his right mind. Minutes later, he was taken to the Providence police station for questioning. Once there, he was led to a conference room on the 3rd floor, and as he was not under arrest, his handcuffs were removed. Detective James, assisted by another detective, began the interrogation. James was armed, as per regulation. Initially, Esteban provided a false name, denied any previous arrests, and claimed innocence. When Detective James warned him that he knew his real identity and was aware of his criminal record, Esteban became agitated and asked the other detective for some water. After the other detective left the room, Esteban managed to seize James's gun under unclear circumstances and lock the door from the inside. Timothy, the other detective, later recounted hearing Detective James screaming for help, saying Esteban was going to kill him. Shots were heard, and when they finally broke down the door, they found James dying from 2 fatal wounds, one to the chest and another to the forehead. Esteban had attacked the detective with his own gun and escaped by shooting out a window in an adjoining room, falling onto the grass below. A chaotic scene ensued outside the police headquarters as local, state, and federal officers launched a relentless citywide manhunt for the suspect. Meanwhile, James was rushed to Providence Hospital, but despite all medical efforts, he was declared deceased. Esteban was apprehended after an hour-long search, following a violent confrontation with a taxi driver. His capture was not easy. He was combative and violent. The police officers struck him 3 times in the face. From there, the officers took him to Rhode Island Hospital, where he was administered sedatives and later interviewed. The exchange was captured on a recording that clearly showcased Esteban's distressed voice. At the same time, the doorbell rang at the Allen home. While their daughter slept, Marge went downstairs to find 3 officers at the door. She invited them in, and they delivered the tragic news inside. Marge, stunned, asked where it had happened. Learning it was at the police station, she couldn't believe it. Of all places, that should have been the safest for a police officer. From that moment, her mind struggled to function normally, and the pain hit her hard. The officers called friends of the Allens to stay with the girls and then escorted Marge to the hospital in a patrol car, as only a direct relative could claim the body. She later recounted how the hospital corridors were filled with police officers, all nodding respectfully as she passed. They led her to the trauma room. Her husband lay on the table. The wounds were lethal, yet not visible. On Monday, April 18, 2005, at 10 a.m., a second interview took place at police headquarters. A hysterical Esteban was interrogated again. During the interview, Esteban often rambled, insisting he was insane and unloved. This exchange was also recorded. Meanwhile, the police chief and James's colleagues gathered at the Providence District Court, awaiting Esteban's arraignment. Beyond showing solidarity and affection for their fallen comrade, they wanted to see the man capable of such actions. The tension in the room was palpable as all eyes turned to Esteban, who walked with difficulty, his hands and feet shackled. Several officers escorted him,